Tonight, let us drift back to the year 1944 and discover one of the strangest, most gentle stories of the Second World War. A story not of weapons, but of imagination. It is the tale of the Ghost Army, a secret unit of American soldiers whose greatest weapon was creativity itself. As the war moved across Europe, the Allied armies needed something unusual. They needed a way to make the enemy believe things that were not true, to make a small force seem enormous, and to make real armies seem to vanish. And so, in the quiet countryside of the United States, a very special unit was quietly assembled. It was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, though the soldiers themselves would come to know it by a far more poetic name, the Ghost Army. The men who joined it were not like other soldiers. Many were artists, drawn from art schools and advertising agencies in New York. There were designers, illustrators, actors, and sound engineers, young men who, in another life, might have painted murals or designed theater sets. Instead, they were given an extraordinary assignment: to deceive one of the most formidable armies in the world, using little more than rubber, canvas, sound, and cleverness. Imagine for a moment their most famous tools: inflatable tanks, great balloons shaped like Sherman tanks, crafted from rubber and painted with careful, loving detail. They weighed barely 100 pounds, light enough for a few men to lift and carry across a field. Yet when they were inflated and arranged in long rows along the countryside, they looked, from the distance of an enemy's binoculars, like a real armored division. Hundreds of tanks, waiting patiently for orders. At night, the soldiers would deflate them gently, fold them up, and move them somewhere new, so that by morning, the enemy's spies would report that an entire army had shifted its position in a single night. But the Ghost Army's illusions did not stop there. They built fake trucks, fake artillery, and even pretend airplanes. They draped fabric over wooden frames to create imaginary bridges and fuel depots. They sewed patches onto their uniforms to suggest units they were not, and painted vehicle markings borrowed from divisions that were, in truth, hundreds of miles away. They drove trucks in endless, looping convoys along the roads, creating wide, winding tracks in the dust that spoke of massive troop movements that had never happened. And then there was the sound. The unit carried powerful loudspeakers, capable of projecting recordings across many miles of quiet countryside. Sound engineers had traveled to actual military bases, capturing the noises of real soldiers at work. The rumble of engines, the clatter of construction, the shouts of men driving stakes into the ground. When the Ghost Army arrived somewhere new, they would play these recordings through the night, so that German patrols, listening in the darkness, would hear an army busily preparing, when in truth, only a few dozen men stood quietly in the fields with their speakers. All of this was woven together with careful artistry. The radio operators sent out streams of invented messages, the kind of chatter a real massive unit would produce, knowing the enemy was listening to every word. The actors among them dressed as officers and strolled through local villages, visiting cafes and markets, letting themselves be overheard in fabricated conversations about plans and positions, planting false stories the way a gardener plants seeds. These deceptions were not small affairs. In the summer of 1944, near the Rhine River, the Ghost Army pretended to be two full divisions, tens of thousands of men. They held that illusion for days, drawing enemy attention away from the true crossing points. In another operation, they impersonated an entire armored corps, moving their inflatable tanks and playing their recorded sounds until the enemy believed a great force was gathering exactly where the Allies wished them to look. It is believed their illusions saved many thousands of lives, not by firing a single shot, but by simply being seen and heard and believed. And yet for decades, these soldiers told almost no one. Their mission was so secret that their families did not know of it. The artists went home, quietly returned to their canvases and studios, and carried the story within them. Some became famous painters and designers, Bill Blass among them, their creativity shaped in part by those strange nights spent inflating tanks under the moonlight. Only many years later did the world learn their story. And in time, these gentle deceivers received the recognition, and gratitude they had quietly earned. There is something very peaceful in this tale if we let it settle in our minds. In the middle of a terrible war, a group of artists found a way to fight with imagination instead of destruction. Their weapons were rubber and paint and sound. Their battlefield was perception itself. They proved that creativity can protect, that cleverness can be a form of kindness, and that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit finds gentle, ingenious ways to end things sooner. So as you close your eyes tonight, perhaps picture that quiet European field, rows of soft rubber tanks resting under a silvery moon, artists standing among them, tools in hand, working through the night so that the morning light would reveal a phantom army. An illusion crafted so carefully, with such care and artistry, that it helped bring a long war gently toward its end. And let that thought carry you, like a soft breeze, into restful, dreamless sleep. Good night. Come in softly now, and settle yourself, because tonight I want to tell you a quiet story. A story about a woman, an old upright piano, and the secrets it held through one of the darkest winters in Europe, the winter of 1942. Picture, if you will, a narrow cobblestone street in a small town, somewhere between Brussels and the sea. The houses lean gently toward one another, as if whispering. And in one of those houses, on the second floor, there lived a piano teacher named Madame Elise Vanden, a woman of about 50, with silver threading through her dark hair and spectacles that she wore low on her nose when she read. Every evening, without fail, her neighbors could hear the piano, gentle melodies, Debussy sometimes, Chopin often. The music floated down through the frosted windows like a lullaby for the whole street, and that was precisely the point, because those melodies were a signal. You see, Elise was not only a piano teacher, she was also a quiet keeper of secrets. During the war, when the occupation spread across her country like a cold fog, ordinary people found small and brave ways to resist. Some printed leaflets, some hid downed amen, and some, like Elise, carried information hidden inside the most ordinary things. Her piano was an old upright, dark walnut, polished by decades of careful hands. Its keys had been pressed by children learning their first scales and by Elise herself night after night. But inside, beneath the strings, tucked behind the felt, there was a hollow space, a small compartment her father, a cabinet maker, had built years before, a hiding place he never explained. He simply said, "A piano holds more than music, Elise, remember that." And so she did. When the resistance needed to move a message, the name of a safe house, a date, a map folded into the size of a postage stamp, it would find its way to Elise's front door, sometimes rolled inside a sheet of music, sometimes tucked into a loaf of bread left on her step. She would wait until evening, when the street was quiet and only the sound of her own footsteps filled the house. And she would lift the lid of the piano, reach into that hidden compartment, and add the secret to the others waiting there. Each Thursday, a young man named Thomas came for his piano lesson. He was a farm boy with rough hands and honest eyes, and he was learning slowly, but he was learning. At the end of each lesson, Elise would hand him a bundle of sheet music to take home and practice. Thomas carried it under his arm through the checkpoints of the town, past soldiers who never gave a second glance to a boy holding his homework, and rolled inside those pages so carefully that not even Thomas knew which piece of music held it, was the week's secret. It was a delicate dance, carried out in whispers and patience. Elise never spoke of it, not to Thomas, not to her sister in the countryside, not even in her own diary. The secrets lived in silence, wrapped in felt and shadow beneath the hammers of the piano. And above them, each night, the music rose like a promise that life and beauty and gentleness could survive anything. There was one evening in the winter of 1943 when soldiers came to her street, checking houses, asking questions. Elise sat down at the piano as they knocked on doors down the lane, and she played, softly at first, then with all the calm she could gather. She played Debussy's Clair de Lune, her hands steady even though her heart was not. And when the knock finally came to her door, she rose unhurried, adjusted her spectacles, and welcomed them in with a polite nod. They looked around the small music room, books, Candles, the old piano, one of them ran a finger along the keys and left. Elise closed the door behind them and sat back down on the bench, and after a long moment, she began to play again. The war eventually loosened its grip on that little town. The fog lifted, the streets filled once more with markets and bicycles and children running without fear. Thomas grew up married and told his grandchildren about his piano teacher who gave him sheet music every Thursday, only learning decades later, from a letter Elise left behind, what those pages had really carried. Elise lived to be an old woman in that same house, and to the very end she kept playing, every evening, the melodies floating down through the windows just as they always had. When she passed, the piano was opened gently, and inside that hidden compartment, nothing remained but a single folded piece of paper in her neat handwriting. It read, "Music was the door, kindness was the key, now let it rest." So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember Elise and her quiet piano, and how even in the hardest of times, gentleness and courage can live side by side, like a lullaby and a secret waiting beneath the same song. Sleep well now, the music is still playing. Tonight, let us drift back to the 1940s, to a quieter corner of the Second World War, one that unfolded not on battlefields, but high above the clouds, where the air grows thin and the sky turns a deep, gentle indigo. This is the story of weather balloons, humble, silent travelers that floated upward each day, carrying with them small instruments and even smaller hopes. And though they never carried weapons, they helped shape the course of the war in ways few people ever knew. Imagine the world of the 1940s. Radio broadcasts hummed from wooden cabinets in parlor rooms. Maps were spread across tables, pinned with flags. And in military headquarters on both sides of the ocean, planners leaned over those maps, asking the same essential question: what will the sky do tomorrow? Because in wartime, weather was everything. A cloudless night might invite bombers. A thick fog could hide a fleet. D-Day, the great invasion of Normandy, depended on a narrow window of tides, moonlight, and calm winds over the English Channel. To plan such moments, commanders needed forecasts, and good forecasts needed observations from high above the ground. And so each morning and evening, at hundreds of stations across the world, weather balloons rose quietly into the sky. They were simple things, large balloons of pale rubber, inflated with helium or hydrogen, tugging gently at their moorings before being released. Beneath them dangled a small box of instruments called a radiosonde, which measured temperature, humidity, and pressure as it climbed. Up and up it went, through the low clouds, past the drifting mist, into air so cold and thin that the balloon swelled like a breath held too long. Finally, miles above the earth, the rubber could stretch no more, and the balloon would burst with a soft pop no one would ever hear. The little instrument box drifted back down beneath a small parachute, sometimes landing in a farmer's field, sometimes in the sea, often with a polite note asking whoever found it to please return it. All the while, as the balloon climbed, it radioed its findings back down to waiting operators. Quiet men and women in wool uniforms, hunched over charts and pencils, transcribing numbers by lamplight. Those numbers became soundings, vertical profiles of the atmosphere, and from many soundings, gathered across whole continents, forecasters could begin to see the weather as it truly was. Vast, connected rivers of air flowing around the globe. The Allies understood this deeply. Britain's Meteorological Office, together with the United States Army Air Forces, built a network of balloon stations stretching from the frozen north of Scotland to the deserts of North Africa. Every ascent added another piece to the puzzle, and the forecasts that emerged were quietly extraordinary. They guided convoy routes across the Atlantic, steering ships around the fiercest storms. They helped bombers choose their moments, nights with clear skies or helpful cloud cover. They told fighter pilots when fog would lift from their airfields. And on the 6th of June 1944, it was a forecast pieced together from balloon soundings and ship reports that told General Eisenhower the narrow break in the weather was real. a window of calm that made the liberation of Europe possible. There were gentle, curious stories along the way too. Balloons launched to spy on the jet streams. Those fast rivers of wind high above revealed currents no one had fully mapped before. Some balloons traveled astonishing distances. A few even drifted across entire oceans, carrying small paper-wrapped instruments that puzzled the farmers who found them. Slowly, flight by flight, the secret architecture of the sky was being drawn for the very first time. And after the war ended, something wonderful happened. All that careful, hard-won knowledge did not disappear. The balloon networks kept rising day after day, year after year. The science of forecasting blossomed, and the humble weather balloon became a permanent, peaceful part of daily life. Even now, somewhere in the world, a balloon is rising this very moment, carrying its quiet instruments through the clouds, sending down its gentle stream of numbers. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, perhaps picture it, a pale balloon letting go of the earth at dawn, rising through soft gray clouds, climbing into the calm blue silence, doing its small, patient work for the people below. It is a reminder that wars are shaped not only by thunder and smoke, but by quiet things, by careful observations, by patient people with pencils and charts, by balloons that simply floated upward to ask the sky a question. Rest now and let the balloon drift on, higher and higher, into the soft and endless evening sky. As the evening settles softly around you, let me tell you a quiet story from a very turbulent time. A story about lighthouse keepers and the gentle courage of those who simply stayed. When the Second World War swept across Europe in 1939, coastlines everywhere changed. Beaches were covered with obstacles. Watchtowers rose where fishing huts once stood. And along many shores, the lighthouses, those tall, patient guardians of the sea, found their bright lights dimmed or extinguished entirely. You see, a shining lighthouse could guide more than friendly ships home. It could also guide enemy vessels or help bombers find their way inland. And so, in Britain and across occupied lands, many lighthouses were darkened for the first time in their long lives. Some were painted in camouflage patterns of soft gray and green. Their keepers were given new instructions and new uncertainties. And yet, someone still had to stay. The lighthouse keepers of the war years were often older men, past the age of military service. Some had tended the same light for 30 or 40 years, climbing the same worn spiral stairs each evening, polishing the same brass fittings until they gleamed like warm honey. They knew the moods of the sea the way a shepherd knows his flock. When the water would grumble against the rocks, when the fog would roll in thick and silent, when the wind would whisper warnings a day ahead. Imagine their lives now. Instead of lighting the great lamp each night, many keepers spent their hours maintaining the machinery anyway, keeping the clockwork rotation smooth, cleaning the enormous lenses with careful, patient hands. The great Fresnel lenses, made of hundreds of precisely ground prisms, still needed tending. The station had to be ready, because one day the order to relight might come, and it must come without hesitation. There were quiet duties too. Keepers listened to the radio for official notices. They watched the horizon, noting whatever they saw into logbooks with steady, unhurried handwriting. Weather, visibility, the occasional distant aircraft. Their observations, humble as they seemed, became part of a vast network of coastal watching that helped keep their homelands safe. And sometimes, in the darkest stretches of the war, some keepers far from the fighting, in neutral countries or in remote corners of the world, made a different kind of choice. They kept their lights burning when they safely could, guiding refugee ships and fishing vessels through dangerous waters. Their beacons became small promises that not every light in the world had gone out. Life at a wartime lighthouse moved slowly, deliberately. There were rounds to make, the lamp room, the storeroom, the little kitchen with its kettle always warm. There were gardens to tend in the sheltered corners behind the tower walls, rows of potatoes and cabbages swaying in salted wind. There were books and letters that arrived irregularly, and the endless, soothing conversation of the sea below. Some keepers had families with them, wives who kept the log neat and the soup simmering Children who did their schoolwork by lamplight and grew up thinking the whole world smelled of paint and brine. Others lived alone with their thoughts and found companions in seabirds and the patient rhythm of the waves. There was risk quietly held, mines drifted into shipping lanes, stray aircraft crossed the night sky, a few coastal stations suffered damage during the long years of conflict, but the keepers' response to danger was rarely dramatic. It was steadiness itself. They repaired what needed repairing. They recorded what needed recording. They climbed the stairs when the stairs needed climbing. And when the war finally ended, when the bells rang out across Europe in the spring of 1945, there was work to do one more time. Around the coasts, one by one, the great lights were rekindled. Keepers who had tended dark lanterns for 6 years climbed their towers on some ordinary evening, struck a match or pressed a switch, and watched the beams stretch out across the water once again. Long ribbons of gold unwinding over the waves, reaching for ships that had waited so long to be guided safely home. Sailors spoke of the joy of seeing those familiar lights return, like finding an old friend waiting on the shore, and the keepers themselves simply wrote the date in their logbooks, refilled the oil, and carried on, because carrying on was what they did best. Perhaps that is the gentlest lesson of their story. Courage does not always shout. Sometimes it is simply showing up, night after night, keeping something ready and true, even when no one can see you doing it, like a small warm light at the edge of a vast dark sea. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, picture one of those towers standing calm against the evening sky. Its keeper upstairs, unhurried, the beams sweeping slowly over quiet water, steady, patient, and always there. Tonight, let us drift back to the spring of 1943, to a quiet London still dimmed by wartime blackouts, and to one of the strangest, most gently clever stories of the Second World War. It is a story of deception, but not of violence. It is a story of paper, of imagination, and of a man who never truly existed, and yet helped change the course of history. By 1943, the war in the Mediterranean was reaching a turning point. The Allied forces, having cleared North Africa, were preparing to push northward into Europe. Everyone could see that Sicily, the island sitting at the toe of Italy, was the obvious next step. Even Winston Churchill had said that anyone but a fool would know they were heading there. And that, of course, was the problem. The Germans knew it too. Sicily was heavily defended, and any direct assault might cost a terrible price in lives. So in the quiet offices of British intelligence, a curious question was asked. What if we could make the obvious seem wrong? What if we could persuade the enemy, using nothing but a letter and a little imagination, that Sicily was only a feint, and that the true invasion would land elsewhere, in Greece, perhaps, or on the island of Sardinia? From this question grew a plan. 2 officers, Ewan Montagu and Charles Comandelli, refined an idea that had first been sketched out in a memorandum. It was delicate, almost whimsical in its logic. They would obtain the body of a man who had died quietly and peacefully, give him a new name, a new identity, and a briefcase full of carefully crafted personal letters. Then they would let the sea carry him to a quiet shore in Spain, where German agents were known to watch and listen. The letters, if the enemy believed them, would whisper a false secret, and German defenses would drift away from Sicily. Finding the body was a quiet, somber task, handled with great care. A man named Glyndŵr Michael, who had died in London, was chosen. His passing had been gentle, and his family's consent was later sought and given. He was given a new name, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. And then, in a small office filled with paper and patience, the intelligence team began to build a life for him. They crafted letters from a sweetheart named Pam. They tucked a theater ticket stub into his pocket. They gave him keys, a bank overdraft notice, a photograph, even unpaid bills. He carried a letter of introduction from the Vice Chief of the Naval Staff, marked as confidential. And inside that letter, wrapped in layers of official caution, was the heart of the deception. The letter hinted that Allied forces would strike at Greece and Sardinia, and that Sicily was to be used only as a cover. Every detail was seeded with care, nothing too obvious, nothing too loud. A good lie, the officers understood, should be soft-spoken. On the night of April 30th, 1943, a submarine called the Seraph surfaced quietly off the coast of Spain, near the town of Huelva. Major William Martin, resting in a life vest, with a briefcase chained gently to his wrist, was laid upon the calm water. The tide took him ashore by morning. Spanish fishermen found him, and the local authorities, as expected, conducted their inquiries. The British consulate requested the return of the briefcase. Just firmly enough to seem worried, which only made it all the more interesting to the watching German agents. The documents were examined, the letters were read, and the false information traveled north through German intelligence channels all the way to Berlin. Whether every senior officer was fully persuaded, we may never know for certain, but the effect was real. German forces were strengthened in Greece and Sardinia in the weeks that followed, while Sicily's defenses remained comparatively lighter. And when the Allied invasion of Sicily came, in July of 1943, it met less resistance than might otherwise have been the case. Many lives, some historians suggest thousands, may have been quietly spared. The story did not end there. Major William Martin was buried with full military honors in a small cemetery in Huelva, his headstone bearing the name of a man who never lived. Years later, after the war, the full story was told in a book called The Man Who Never Was, and it has been retold in films ever since. There is something almost poetic about it all. A war fought with enormous machines and vast armies, and yet, at one small turning point, history bent instead to the weight of a briefcase, a few letters, and the quiet kindness of giving an unnamed man a dignity and a story of his own. Glyndŵr Michael, who had known hardship in life, was given, in death, a name, a romance, and a place in history. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture that quiet Spanish shoreline in the early morning light, the calm water, the gentle tide, and the strange, soft-spoken trick that helped shorten a terrible war. Sometimes it is not the loudest force that moves the world, but the quietest, most patient idea, whispered on paper and carried gently by the sea. Good night and rest well. Close your eyes, if you like, and let the gentle rhythm of these words carry you somewhere far away, to the grey-green seas of the Second World War, where a small cat lived a life more remarkable than any sailor aboard. Her name was Unsinkable Sam, though in the beginning she was simply known as Oscar, a black and white cat with calm green eyes and a quiet, unhurried way of moving about the decks, as if she owned every plank of wood and every brass railing. Her story begins aboard a German warship called the Bismarck, one of the largest and most feared vessels of its time. In May of 1941, the Bismarck sailed into the North Atlantic, a mighty ship cutting through cold grey waters. But after a pursuit across the ocean, the great vessel was sent to the sea floor. And yet, in the aftermath, drifting among the wreckage in the chilly water, sailors from a British destroyer, the HMS Cossack, spotted something small and alive. A little cat, paddling patiently, waiting to be rescued. They lifted her aboard, wrapped her in warm cloth, and gave her a name, Oscar. The sailors were amazed. Here was a creature who had survived the loss of one of the greatest ships afloat, and she remained as calm as ever, settling onto a warm spot near the engine room as if nothing unusual had happened at all. For the next few months, Oscar lived aboard the Cossack, sailing through the Mediterranean, keeping watch over the crew with her soft, steady gaze. Cats were welcome aboard ships in those days. They kept the mice away, and perhaps more importantly, they offered comfort. A small, warm reminder of home in the middle of endless sea. But in October of 1941, the Cossack was struck by a torpedo while escorting a convoy near Gibraltar. The ship was badly damaged, and though sailors worked through the day to save her, she eventually slipped beneath the waves. And once again, Oscar was found, alive, unbothered, sitting quietly among the survivors, waiting to be brought to shore. By now, the sailors had begun to whisper about this remarkable little cat. Twice she had survived, twice she had been pulled from the sea, and so they gave her a new name, Unsinkable Sam. There was something almost reassuring about her presence, as if she carried a quiet promise that no matter what happened, some things endure. Sam was then given a new home aboard an aircraft carrier, the HMS Ark Royal, and here is the gentle twist of fate, for it had been an aircraft from the Ark Royal that had once pursued the Bismarck all those months before. Life aboard the great carrier suited Sam well. Sailors made her a small hammock, and she could often be found sleeping peacefully there, swaying gently with the ship, or curled up near the anchor capstan, which she seemed to consider her own personal cushion. But the sea had one more chapter to write. In November of 1941, the Ark Royal was torpedoed near Gibraltar. The ship settled slowly, so slowly, in fact, that nearly all of the crew was rescued safely, including, of course, Sam. When they found her, she was clinging to a floating plank, soaked but serene, as though she had simply decided to wait for her next ride. 3 ships, 3 sinkings, and 1 small cat still purring. The story reached newspapers back in Britain, and Sam became something of a quiet legend. She was finally brought ashore, retiring to a home for sailors in Belfast, where she spent her remaining years in comfort. No more cold seas, no more alarms, just warm windowsills, gentle hands, and long, unhurried naps. Sailors came to see her, to touch her fur perhaps, and to feel a little of her calm, because that was her true gift. In a time of great storms, Sam was a small anchor of peace. She reminded everyone that survival doesn't always belong to the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it belongs to the quietest soul aboard, the one who simply rests, waits, and trusts that the water will carry them to safety. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember little unsinkable Sam, the cat who rode the waves and always found her way to dry land and warm hands. May your own night be as calm as a hammock swaying gently on a quiet ship, and may you rest, like Sam, knowing you are safe, and that morning will always come to carry you gently home. Good night, sleep well, and dream of calm seas. Close your eyes if you like, and picture a quiet kitchen in wartime Britain. The year is 1942, and somewhere in a small brick house in Yorkshire, a grandmother is grating a tiny sliver of chocolate into warm milk, stretching it further than anyone would have thought possible. The fire crackles softly. Outside, the blackout curtains are drawn, and the world beyond the window is still and dark. This is the story of how something as small as a bar of chocolate came to mean so much. Before the war, chocolate had been one of Britain's quiet pleasures. The great factories of Cadbury in Bourneville, Rowntree in York, and Macintosh in Halifax had turned cocoa and sugar into everyday comforts. A treat for children on a Saturday afternoon, a small luxury tucked into a workman's lunch, a gift shared between friends. Chocolate was woven gently into the rhythm of ordinary life. But war changes things. Britain, an island nation, depended on ships crossing the oceans, convoys of merchant vessels carrying food, fuel, and raw materials through dangerous waters. Cocoa came from far away, from West Africa and the Americas, and sugar from distant plantations too. Every ship that carried cocoa beans was a ship that might be needed for grain or oil or something else the nation could not live without. And so, in the summer of 1942, chocolate was rationed. Each person was allowed just a small amount each week, often no more than 2 or 3 ounces, and sometimes less. 3 little squares, perhaps, where a whole bar once was. The factories adapted in remarkable ways. Recipes were reworked to stretch the precious cocoa. Chocolate bars became thinner. Fillings appeared, made from dried fruit or snapped rice, to make a small bar feel generous. Some confectioners blended cocoa with substitutes, carob or barley, whatever could be coaxed into something sweet. Children of that era still remember the taste of wartime chocolate, different, less rich, but treasured all the more for being rare. And yet chocolate found a new purpose during those years. The government recognized something quietly important: morale. A small piece of chocolate could lift a tired heart. It was packed into the rations of servicemen and women, tucked into their kits, as a reminder of home. Aircrew carried it on long flights. Nurses slipped it to soldiers in hospital wards. A square of chocolate became a small, sweet promise. That comfort still existed, that home was waiting, that ordinary life would return one day. There was something else too, something rather beautiful. Chocolate became a currency of kindness. A child might save their ration for a birthday. A neighbor might share theirs with a family who had suffered loss. Sweethearts exchanged chocolate on anniversaries, made precious by scarcity. When sweets could not be bought freely, people made them stretch. Boiled sweets were sucked slowly, bars were cut into slivers, and cocoa was rationed out spoonful by spoonful into Sunday treats. In a time of austerity, people discovered how much joy could be folded into very little. The convoys deserve a gentle mention here as well. Those ships sailed in groups, protected together across vast and cold oceans, carrying the cocoa beans and the sugar and the wheat that kept the nation fed. Chocolate rationing was, in its quiet way, a tribute to those journeys, a recognition that every luxury came at a cost, and that a nation at peace with small sacrifices could endure a great deal. Families understood this. When they unwrapped their weekly allowance, they understood the long voyage it had taken to reach them, and they were grateful. The war ended in 1945, but interestingly, chocolate rationing did not end with it. The years after the war brought their own shortages, and sweets remained rationed longer than almost anything else. Not fully free again until 1954. When the restrictions finally lifted, there were quiet celebrations. Children who had grown up knowing only 3 squares a week could at last buy a whole bar. Some said the chocolate tasted sweeter than they remembered. And perhaps it did, not because of the sugar, but because of the waiting. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of that grandmother in Yorkshire stirring her thin cocoa by firelight. Think of the convoys crossing the dark, calm ocean, and the small bars of chocolate carried in the pockets of people far from home. Chocolate rationing changed Britain not by taking something away, but by revealing how much a small kindness can hold. How a tiny square of sweetness can carry comfort across an ocean, through a blackout, and all the way down the years to us tonight. Rest now and sleep gently, just as they did, one small sweet square at a time. Tonight, let us drift back to the year 1943, into the quiet halls and dusty museums of Europe, where an unlikely group of heroes moved gently through the shadows of war. They were known as the Monuments Men, and their story is one of the most tender and hopeful chapters of the Second World War. As the war swept across Europe, something precious hung in the balance. Not weapons, not borders, but beauty itself. Centuries of art, paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer, sculptures carved by Michelangelo, cathedral windows that had caught the light for hundreds of years. All of these treasures stood in the path of advancing armies and falling bombs. And so, a small group of museum directors, curators, artists, and art historians from the Allied nations was quietly assembled. Their mission was unlike any other in military history: to protect and rescue the cultural treasures of Europe, not with guns, but with knowledge, patience, and care. Many of these men were older than the average soldier. Some wore glasses, some had never held a rifle at all. They had spent their lives in quiet museum corridors, cataloging paintings and dusting marble statues. Now, in the middle of a world at war, they carried maps and lists instead of weapons. Lists of the great cathedrals, the archives, the museums that must be spared, if at all possible. One of their gentle victories unfolded before the famous Normandy landings. The Monuments Men worked to map out the historic towns and cities that should be avoided wherever military strategy allowed. The beautiful city of Chartres, crowned by its soaring Gothic cathedral with soft blue stained glass, was spared, standing tall and unharmed as the war passed around it. In Paris, as the Germans withdrew, a German officer named Dietrich von Koltitz, urged by others and moved by reason, chose not to carry out orders to destroy the city's bridges and monuments. The City of Light remained whole, its galleries and towers untouched. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the story happened behind enemy lines. In remote castles, salt mines, and hidden repositories, The retreating forces had stored thousands upon thousands of stolen artworks. The great altarpiece of Ghent, masterpieces by Vermeer, rooms filled with gold and canvases stacked against cold stone walls, waiting in the dark. The monument's men followed in the footsteps of the armies, searching these hidden places with quiet determination. When they found them, deep in the Altersee salt mine in Austria or in the tunnels of Merkers in Germany, they found treasure beyond imagining. Entire wings of museums, the crown jewels of emperors, the belongings of families who had lost everything. The men worked slowly and carefully. They understood that a painting by Leonardo could not simply be lifted and carried. They built gentle cradles for sculptures. They wrapped canvases in soft cloth. They kept detailed records, photographing and cataloging everything so that one day each artwork could find its way home, return to the museum, the church, or the family to whom it truly belonged. One of the most moving moments came when the Ghent altarpiece, a magnificent painted panel that many consider one of the world's greatest artworks, was found crated in the salt mine, safe and sound after years in the darkness. The men who found it were overcome with quiet joy. Something beautiful had survived. Something meant for all humanity would see the light again. By the end of the war, these few hundred men and women had located and returned millions of artworks and cultural objects. Paintings went back to their museums. Torah scrolls went back to synagogues. Family photographs went back to homes. Their work did not end when the guns fell silent. They stayed on for years afterward, sorting through catalogs and crates, matching each treasure with its rightful place. Their legacy lives on in quiet ways. The museums of Europe still stand, their galleries glowing with the same masterpieces that hung there before the war. Monuments, men, organizations continue their work even today, searching for lost artworks and returning them to their families. A gentle reminder that the story is never quite finished. And so, as you settle into sleep tonight, imagine those quiet figures moving through candlelit tunnels and peaceful museum halls. Artists and scholars with paint still under their fingernails, carrying the world's beauty gently through the darkest of times. They remind us that even in humanity's hardest hours, there are those who choose to protect what is beautiful, those who believe that art, memory, and hope are worth saving. Rest now softly, knowing that beauty endures. And that gentle hands, even in wartime, chose to keep the light burning. Good night. Hello and welcome. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your shoulders soften. Tonight, we drift back to the years of the Second World War, but not to the loud parts. Instead, we remember something small and quiet and gentle. The story of the pigeons, the humble hero birds who carried messages over the battlefield, wings steady against the sky. Long before radios were small enough to fit in a pocket, and long before signals could always be trusted, armies relied on birds. Pigeons, specifically, homing pigeons with their remarkable gift, an inner compass, a memory for place, an unshakable instinct that guided them home across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar land. A pigeon could be carried in a small crate to some distant corner of the world, released into the open sky, and somehow, it would find its way back to its loft, back to the very same rooftop where it had been raised. During the war, thousands of these birds served quietly. They were kept in specially built lofts, some mounted on trucks, some on small boats, some tucked behind the lines in quiet farmyards. Soldiers cared for them gently, feeding them grain by hand, speaking to them softly. And when everything else failed, when wires were cut, when radio silence was ordered, when a unit was surrounded and unseen, it was often a pigeon that carried the message home. The birds flew through weather and uncertainty, over fields and rivers and sleeping villages. Small capsules, no bigger than a fingertip, were attached to their legs. Inside, a folded slip of paper, a few careful words that might mean the difference between confusion and rescue. And off the pigeon would go, a soft gray shape rising into the clouds, steady and unhurried, doing what it knew how to do. Some of these birds became quietly famous. There was a pigeon named G.I. Joe, an American bird who flew a long distance to deliver a message that paused a bombing run, saving a village of people who had been mistakenly thought to be in enemy hands. There was a pigeon called Commando who made trip after trip across the English Channel, carrying intelligence from occupied France back home, again and again, until the war's end. And there was Mary of Exeter, a brave little bird who returned from many difficult journeys, each time resting, healing, and then flying again when she was needed. In Britain, the birds were honored with a special medal, the Dickin Medal, created to recognize the gallantry of animals. It reads, simply and beautifully, "For gallantry, we also serve." 32 pigeons received it, more than any other kind of animal. Think of that. Small, gentle creatures, outturning the medals given to dogs and horses alike, simply by flying home. There is something deeply calming about imagining them. Picture it with me if you like. A cool evening in the English countryside, a soft mist settling over hedgerows, a loft door opening gently and a keeper, perhaps a young woman from the women's auxiliary, offering grain from her open palm. The pigeon steps forward unafraid, its feathers gray and rose and soft as ash. Somewhere far away, another bird is descending in wide, slow circles, finding its rooftop, finding its home safe at last. These pigeons never understood the war. They knew only the sky, the wind, the pull of home. And perhaps that is why their story feels so peaceful to tell. In the middle of a vast and troubled time, these small birds simply did what they knew. They flew, they remembered, they returned. They asked for nothing but grain and a quiet perch and the company of their flock. The people who worked with them grew deeply fond of them. There are photographs, if you ever look for them, soldiers smiling, holding a pigeon in cupped hands like something precious, because it was precious. A single bird, weighing less than a loaf of bread, carrying hope in a capsule on its leg. When the war ended, most of the pigeons were retired to quiet lofts. Some lived out long, gentle lives, cooing softly in the afternoons, preening their feathers in the sun. The world moved on to new technologies, new ways of sending messages. But the memory of the hero pigeons remains, honored in small museums, in quiet plaques, in the stories told by those who remember. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps hold this image gently in your mind. A lone pigeon flying through soft evening light, wingbeats slow and even, carrying its small message safely home. No fear, no hurry, just instinct and sky and the quiet certainty of returning to the ones who wait. Sleep well now and dream of gentle wings over peaceful fields, carrying nothing but light. Tonight, let me tell you a quiet and rather remarkable story from the Second World War, a story about maps, games, and the gentle power of cleverness. It is the story of the mapmaker who hid escape routes in board games. In the darkest years of the war, when the world seemed to hold its breath, thousands of soldiers captured by enemy forces found themselves behind the wire fences of prison camps. These camps were often far from home, deep in Germany or in occupied territories, and the men inside them dreamed, quietly, of freedom. But there was a branch of British intelligence devoted to helping them. It was called MI9, and its task was strange and wonderful: to smuggle hope into prison camps, to send tools, maps, and knowledge to captured airmen and soldiers, so that if they ever found a moment of opportunity, they might slip away and make their long journey home. The challenge, of course, was how to get these things past the guards. Prisoners were searched, parcels were opened and examined, letters were read, and yet, the enemy guards, like people everywhere, could not inspect everything. There was simply too much. So MI9 looked for objects that would seem perfectly ordinary, even comforting, and hid secrets inside them. One of the most charming of these methods involved board games. In wartime Britain, the popular game of Monopoly was printed by a company called Waddington's, and the government quietly asked for its help. Behind the scenes, in rooms far from the factory floor, certain special copies were prepared. Copies with hidden treasures tucked inside their ordinary cardboard world. Tiny silk maps were slid beneath the game board itself, hidden between layers of paper where no one would think to look. Silk, you see, was the perfect material. Unlike ordinary paper, silk does not rustle loudly, it does not tear easily in the rain, and it can be folded into the smallest space, even inside a dice cup or rolled into a playing piece. A compass might be disguised as a small game token. A metal file might lie flat inside the board. Even German money, it was said, found its way into some of these games, hidden among the stacks of play currency. And here is where the mapmakers themselves come in, the quiet artists of escape. The most famous of them was a man named Christopher Clayton Hutton, known to his friends as Clutty. He was an inventor and a problem solver by nature, a man who loved the small, patient work of hiding important things inside harmless things. He studied the game boards, the inks, the papers, the printing presses. He worked with silk printers who could compress a full map of a region. Rivers, roads, railway lines, safe houses, onto a piece of fabric no larger than a handkerchief. Think for a moment about how gentle this work was, a kind of quiet counterweight to the noise of war. While others built machines of destruction, these people printed maps and tucked them into toys. Their weapons were patience, imagination, and the assumption that kindness and cleverness together could outwit suspicion. The special games were sent through charitable channels, parcels marked with a subtle code that told the prisoners inside which boxes contained the hidden gifts. The guards, seeing a familiar and innocent game of Monopoly, waved them through. After all, who would suspect a board game? Inside the camps, the prisoners played in the evenings, as prisoners do, rolling dice, moving small tokens across colorful squares, telling stories, keeping their spirits alive. And when a carefully chosen moment arrived, a player could quietly lift the board, peel back the layers, and find what had been waiting for him all along. A silk map folded soft as a moth's wing, a compass small enough to hide in a pocket, a message that he was not forgotten. How many escapes were made possible this way, no one can say with certainty. The records were largely destroyed, and the men who used these maps kept their secrets as they were asked to do. But it is believed that hundreds of airmen and soldiers found their way to freedom, crossing mountains by night, following rivers, reading the delicate printed lines of silk, guided home by a map that had once lived inside a game. And that perhaps is the most beautiful part of this story. Board games are meant to bring people together, to pass long evenings, to remind us that even in hard times, we can still sit together, laugh, and imagine. MI9 understood this. They turned a symbol of comfort into a vessel of hope, a small cardboard world with a hidden door. So tonight, as you settle into rest, you might picture that quiet scene, a candlelit table in a distant camp, a board game mid-play, a prisoner's hand resting gently on the edge of the board, and beneath it, waiting patiently, a silken thread leading home. Let the story rest now as you do, soft and quiet and kind. Good night and sleep well. Settle in now and let your shoulders soften. Tonight, we drift back to the summer of 1944, to the quiet fields of southern England, where one of history's gentlest yet most remarkable deceptions unfolded, not through force, but through whispers carried on invisible radio waves. By that summer, the war in Europe had turned. The Allies had landed in Normandy on the 6th of June, and the great question hanging over everyone's mind was simple: where next? The Germans believed the Normandy landings might only be a feint, a distraction before the true invasion at the narrowest part of the English Channel, near a region of France called Pas-de-Calais. And the Allies, knowing this belief existed, decided not to correct it, but to feed it, gently, carefully, like tending a small flame. This effort became known as Operation Fortitude South. Its goal was to make the German High Command believe that an entire army, the First United States Army Group, existed in southeastern England, patiently waiting to strike at Calais. In truth, this army was largely a phantom. Its commander was a real and respected general, George Patton, whose reputation alone lent the fiction a convincing weight. But the soldiers themselves. Many were rubber tanks, wooden aircraft, inflatable landing craft, and empty tents arranged in tidy rows across the countryside. German reconnaissance planes were allowed, on occasion, to photograph these scenes, capturing just enough detail to seem authentic. But the most delicate part of the illusion was carried on the radio. You see, in those days, military intelligence listened closely to one another's wireless transmissions. The volume and pattern of radio traffic in a region could reveal where troops were gathered. So in the fields of Kent and Sussex, radio operators, real people, sitting in dim trailers, lamps glowing softly against the evening dark, began to create a fiction out of thin air. They generated thousands of messages each week, mimicking the rhythms of a genuine army headquarters. Ordinary chatter about supply requests, transport schedules, and routine administration. Nothing secret, nothing dramatic. Just the quiet hum of a busy military organization that did not truly exist. The detail mattered. The fictional units had their own clerks, each with a distinctive typing style, so that enemy analysts would recognize familiar hands. Units that were in fact fighting in Normandy sent duplicate messages back to England, adding to the sense that their real headquarters remained across the Channel. Traffic was even made deliberately dull and realistic, because perfection, the deceivers knew, could arouse suspicion. A few genuine mistakes, a few withheld transmissions, made the whole fabric feel lived-in and true. On the German side, listening posts stretched from Norway to Spain, antennas reaching into the night sky, operators with headphones pressed to their ears, scribbling down fragments of this manufactured conversation. Much of what they gathered flowed to a team of analysts in Berlin and through a web of double agents, most famously a Spaniard codenamed Garbo, who had earned the deep trust of German intelligence while secretly working for the British. The picture was confirmed, polished, and delivered to Hitler's own desk. Worked, even weeks after the Normandy landings, when the battle in France was fierce and urgent, the German command held back powerful divisions, 15 of them, some say more, keeping them near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Those soldiers stood ready in the wrong place, watching the wrong horizon, while the real fighting happened elsewhere. The Phantom Army, made of rubber, wood, and radio static, had accomplished what real divisions might have needed great sacrifice to achieve. There is something quietly beautiful in that thought, that in the middle of such a vast and heavy conflict, one of the decisive contributions was made not by weapons, but by patience, imagination, and the careful weaving of ordinary-sounding words. Typed reports, steady voices, the soft crackle of a wireless in a darkened room, all of it joining together like threads in a tapestry, forming a picture the enemy believed, because every small detail felt true. By late summer, as Allied armies broke out of Normandy and pushed across France, the illusion was finally spent. The phantom divisions dissolved back into the quiet English countryside. The tents folded, the inflatable tanks deflated with soft sighs, the radios fell silent one by one. The deception had played its part and faded away, known fully only to a handful of people, and to history much later. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture those quiet English fields under a summer sky, rows of canvas tents catching the evening breeze, harmless and hollow, and nearby, a young radio operator speaking calm, ordinary words into the night, words that traveled invisibly across the water, settling into enemy notebooks like seeds of confusion, words that helped shorten a war without a single shot being fired. The story fades now, like a signal drifting out over calm water, and you may let it carry you gently onward into rest. Let me tell you a quiet little story tonight, a story about a tea break, a misty English morning, and how one of the most ordinary moments imaginable helped shape the greatest seaborne invasion in history. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift back together to the spring of 1944. The English countryside was green and soft that spring. Hedgerows hummed with birdsong, and the fields of southern England seemed almost sleepy, as if the land itself were resting before what was to come. But beneath that calm surface, the country was quietly filling with soldiers. Young men from America, Canada, Britain, and many other lands, all waiting, all training, all preparing for a day that would come to be known as D-Day. Now planning an invasion of that scale was an extraordinary thing. Imagine organizing the movement of over 150,000 men, thousands of ships, planes, vehicles, and supplies, all across a channel famous for its unpredictable weather. The planning rooms hummed day and night with maps, charts, cigarettes, and strong tea. Oh, so much tea. For the British planners, tea was not a luxury. It was a ritual, a small anchor of calm in a sea of enormous responsibility. And it was during one of these tea breaks that something important happened. The story goes, and history keeps its gentler details close, that in a quiet moment, away from the great maps and the pressure of senior officers, a few planners and forecasters stepped outside into the cool morning air, cups warming their hands, and simply talked, not about grand strategy, but about the weather, about the tides, about the moon, small things, human things. And in that unhurried conversation, a realization began to settle gently into place. The invasion could not succeed on strength alone. It would need patience, and it would need to wait for a very particular kind of day. A day with a late rising moon to light the paratroopers' way in darkness. A low tide shortly after dawn, so the landing craft could see the obstacles hidden beneath the water, and calm enough seas for the smallest boats to survive the crossing. These conditions, discussed so casually over tea, were assembled by a quiet Scottish meteorologist named Group Captain James Stagg, a man who carried the enormous weight of weather forecasting with calm, steady shoulders. You see, in 1944, there were no satellites, no weather apps. Forecasters had to read the sky the way sailors read the sea, with experience, intuition, and careful observation. As June arrived, General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, a man known for his warm smile and steady calm, faced an agonizing wait. The original date, June the 5th, was threatened by a storm rolling in from the Atlantic. The winds howled, the rain fell, and the seas grew rough. Some advisors suggested postponement for weeks, a delay that could have unraveled months of careful planning and secrecy. But then, on the evening of June the 4th, Stagg delivered his quiet forecast. Careful, measured, almost a whisper in the tense room. There would be a brief lull in the weather, a narrow window of calmer skies on June the 6th. It was a gamble, a gentle, hopeful gamble, built on the patient science of men who had learned to listen to the wind. Eisenhower paused, considered, and then said the simple, famous words, "Okay, we'll go." And so it was that the invasion proceeded on June the 6th, 1944, in that small window of calm that the forecasters had found. It was not a perfect day. The seas were still choppy, and some parachutists drifted far from their targets, but the lull held just long enough. And the lessons learned from those tidal and weather discussions, those quiet conversations that perhaps began over tea, shaped the timing of one of history's most consequential days. There is something deeply soothing in this story, isn't there? That amid the enormity of war, with its generals and grand strategies, the turning point came down to patience, listening, and small human moments. A cup of tea warming tired hands, a quiet conversation under a grey English sky, a weatherman's calm voice cutting through doubt. It reminds us that even the largest events in history are shaped by small, careful choices, by people paying gentle attention to the world around them, the moon rising late, the tide turning at just the right hour, a storm parting, briefly, like a curtain. And tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can picture that English morning, the green fields, the soft light, the distant sound of gulls, and the quiet confidence of people who trusted careful, patient work. The world can be changed not only by thunder and noise, but by stillness, by listening, and by a well-timed cup of tea. Rest now softly, and let the gentle tides of sleep carry you onward, just as they carried history toward that calm morning in June. Good night. As the evening settles in, the world grows quiet, let me tell you a gentle and rather remarkable story from the Second World War. A story not of battles, but of imagination, deception, and quiet ingenuity on the English countryside at night. During the dark years of the war, when German bomber aircraft flew across the Channel under the cover of darkness, the cities of Britain faced a terrible threat. London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Bristol, these great cities were lit, even dimly, by the everyday glow of human life. And from high above, that glow was all a bomber crew needed. They followed the light. and dropped their cargo on the sleeping streets below. But Britain had a clever idea. What if the light itself could lie? And so, beginning in 1940, a most curious project was born. It was given the code name Starfish, chosen partly because the initials of the department behind it spelled out SDF, which someone gently reshaped into the name of the creature that scatters its arms in so many directions, much like these decoys did across the countryside. The concept was beautifully simple in the way that clever things often are. Far from the real cities, in open fields and quiet moors, teams of men built imitation cities, not with bricks or mortar, but with light and fire and shadow. They were called starfish sites, and they were paintings made of light. Fires were lit in careful patterns on the ground, arranged to mimic, from thousands of feet above, the burning streets of a city under attack. Electric lights were laid out along wires to suggest streets and railway sidings. Some sites even had a little hut, set alight and encouraged to burn, its crackling flames casting that familiar amber glow onto low clouds. A glow so like a town, a blaze that a pilot many thousands of feet up could scarcely tell the difference. Some of the larger sites grew wonderfully elaborate. They had rolling fire baskets, all-soaked rags, and crews who worked through the night with buckets and matches, waiting for the distant drone of aircraft engines. When the bombers came, the starfish crews would spring into action, lighting their decoys, drawing the fire of the sky away from the real homes and hospitals and schools down the road. Think of these men for a moment, if you will. They were often volunteers, farmers, railway workers, local tradesmen, standing in dark fields in the middle of the night, in the cold and the quiet, watching the sky. Their task required a strange kind of courage and a very particular patience. They had to know when to light the fires and, just as importantly, when to put them out, so the illusion remained convincing night after night. Did it work? In many cases, yes, beautifully. It is believed that the starfish sites drew away a meaningful share of the bombs that might otherwise have fallen on Britain's cities. Over the course of the war, more than 200 starfish sites were operated, and the deception grew ever more refined, coordinating with the real cities themselves, which would sometimes dim their lights on purpose so that the false cities would shine brighter and seem more real. There is something almost poetic about it all. In a time of such enormous machinery of war, thousands of aircraft, tons of steel, the defense that helped was, in its own way, an artwork. Shadows and embers, theater staged on hillsides, a story told in firelight meant to be believed by strangers passing overhead in the dark. And the bombers, we can imagine, flew on toward the glow, released their burdens onto empty fields and quiet grass, and turned for home believing they had struck the heart of a city. The moors and meadows absorbed what fell, sometimes with little more than scorched grass to show for it. The real towns, just beyond the hills, slept on, a little more safely because of the trick. Of course, the starfish crews could not save everyone, and the war brought hardship that no clever deception could undo. But this little chapter of history reminds us of something gentle and true, that human creativity finds remarkable ways to protect what it loves, that even in the darkest of times, people stood in cold fields with buckets of oil and matches, not to harm anyone, but simply to mislead, to distract, and to shield their neighbors. Tonight, as you rest, you might picture those quiet English fields, the low clouds tinged amber by carefully placed flames, the patient men watching the sky, and the sleeping towns nearby, unaware of the quiet performance unfolding on their behalf. The night was a canvas, and kind, clever hands painted it with light. And so the story ends, as all good bedtime stories should, with the threat passing over, the fires dying down to embers, and the dawn coming soft and grey over a countryside that held its secrets well. Sleep now gently, and let the quiet fields of that long-ago night keep watch over your dreams. Tonight, let us drift gently beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, back to the year 1944, and settle into the quiet, remarkable story of a submarine called the USS Tang, a vessel that, in a strange and sobering twist of fate, became the only submarine in history known to have been sunk by its own torpedo. The Tang was an American submarine, sleek and long, painted a soft gray that blended with the sea. She was commanded by a captain named Richard O'Kane, a calm and skilled officer who was widely admired by his crew. Under his guidance, the Tang became one of the most successful submarines of the entire war. Night after night, patrol after patrol, she slipped through the warm waters of the Pacific, and her crew grew confident in her, perhaps a little too confident, though who could blame them? Picture life aboard her for a moment. The interior was narrow and close, filled with the gentle hum of engines, the soft glow of red lights at night, and the quiet rhythms of men eating, sleeping, and keeping watch. Torpedoes rested in their tubes like long, patient needles. The crew called their torpedoes their tin fish, and they cared for them like prized possessions, checking each one carefully before it was sent gliding out into the deep. By the autumn of 1944, the Tang was on her fifth war patrol near the Formosa Strait. It had been, by every measure, an extraordinary patrol. In a single night, she had attacked a convoy and sent multiple ships to the bottom. Her torpedoes, once troubled by early war faults, were now running true. The crew was tired but quietly proud, the kind of deep satisfaction that comes after long, careful work done well. In the small hours of October the 25th, the Tang found one last ship, a transport, damaged and struggling, guarded by an escort vessel. There was just one torpedo left in the after tube, a single final fish. Captain O'Kane decided to use it. The night was calm, the sea gentle, and the Tang fired. The torpedo left the tube and began its run, but something went wrong. Somewhere inside, a small mechanical fault, a malfunction in its steering mechanism, caused the torpedo to bend its path in a slow, wide curve. Instead of running straight toward the target, it began turning back, circling around like a tired swimmer returning to shore. On the bridge of the Tang, men watched the surface. Then, in the pale darkness, they saw it, awake, moving toward them. There was no time. In less than a minute, the torpedo struck the submarine near her stern, and the Tang went down quickly into the cold silence of the sea. She had been on the surface, and in those final seconds, several men were swept into the water. Down below, in the flooded dark submarine, a small number of men survived in an air pocket, breathing the last breathable air. Using a special diving escape device, a few of them rose through the water, a long and difficult ascent toward the light above. In the end, only a handful of the Tang's crew survived the night. They were rescued from the water, and in a strange turn of history, they were picked up by a Japanese patrol boat and spent the remainder of the war as prisoners. Among them was Captain O'Kane himself, the only submarine captain of the war to survive being sunk by his own ship's torpedo. And here is where the story settles into something gentler, because even though the Tang was lost, her story did not end in silence. She had, in her short life, accomplished more than almost any submarine before her, dozens of ships sent down, countless tons of supply lines broken. After the war, her captain received the Medal of Honor, and the survivors were eventually returned home, welcomed back with quiet honor. Richard O'Kane lived a long life afterward, until 1994, and the Navy later named a destroyer in his honor. There is something almost poetic in the way the sea works, isn't there? How even the most carefully built machines can be undone by a single small fault, how a weapon can circle back like a thought returning to the mind. The Tang rests now in the deep, in waters miles above her, and somewhere near that place lies the wreck of the very ship she fired that last torpedo at. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine that calm October sea, the gentle swell of the Pacific, the pale light before dawn, and a small gray submarine that gave everything she had in one final, circling moment. The waters are still now, the story is told, and it is time softly to rest. Close your eyes if you like, and let us drift back gently to a quiet time in history. A time when something as soft as wool and as humble as a pair of knitting needles helped protect a nation. In the years of the Second World War, across the towns and villages of Britain, and in countries across Europe, there sat, by fireplaces and in front windows, millions of grandmothers, mothers, and young women, knitting. It was an ordinary pastime then. Sweaters for soldiers, socks for sailors, warm scarves for pilots flying high in the cold sky above the clouds. Everyone knitted. Wool was everywhere, and so were the needles, clicking softly, rhythmically, like a gentle heartbeat in almost every home. And that is exactly what made knitting so very interesting to those who fought a quieter war, a war of secrets. You see, in occupied lands and in the nervous streets of wartime cities, enemy watchers were everywhere. Written notes could be found, spoken messages could be overheard, but who would ever suspect a sweet elderly woman quietly knitting a cardigan in her parlor of carrying military secrets? And so the codes began. Knitting, you see, has a hidden language all its own. Every stitch is a decision, a knit or a purl, a loop leaning left or leaning right, a stitch slipped, a yarn wrapped twice, a hole made deliberately in the fabric. To the untrained eye, a knitted scarf is just a scarf, a bit lumpy perhaps and lovingly made, but to someone who knew how to read it, that lumpy scarf could speak volumes. A single purl stitch dropped into a stretch of plain knitting might mean one thing: two holes in a row; another, the width of a stripe; a number, the number of stitches between changes; a coordinate, hidden within the gentle rhythms of wool. Messages could travel, invisible in plain sight. There are stories, whispered down through history, of knitting circles used this way. Grandmothers who kept count of trains passing through their villages, soldiers, wagons, supplies, and translated the numbers into their needles afterward, click by careful click. Women who sat near railway stations, knitting placidly, while their sharp old eyes counted everything that moved, storing it all in patterns no inspector could decipher. The authorities on both sides took it seriously. Instructions were issued to censors and examiners at borders, telling them to inspect knitted items, to look closely at the patterns, and even to confiscate suspicious-looking knitting. Codes of knits and purls were genuinely studied, the way other written codes were. Some knitting patterns in occupied Europe were said to carry resistance messages, descriptions of troop movements, warnings, maps stitched loop by loop. And it was not only secret messages that wool carried. Knitting also carried something just as precious: hope. A sweater sent to a soldier far away, with perhaps a small, private pattern woven into the collar that only he would recognize. A signal from home that said, softly, "We are thinking of you, we love you, hold on." Imagine for a moment one of these quiet women. Evening settles over her little house. A lamp glows warmly. She rocks gently in her chair, needles clicking in that soft, familiar rhythm, tick, 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 like a lullaby. In her lap, a gray scarf grows longer row by row. To anyone passing by the window, she's simply keeping her hands busy through the long evening. But in her mind and in her needles, she carries something precious. Perhaps a count of lorries on the road today. Perhaps a time, perhaps a name. Stitch and stitch and stitch. The secret slips quietly into the wool, safe and silent, wrapped in warmth. Was every grandmother a spy? Of course not. Most were simply grandmothers making warm things for the people they loved. But the idea that they could have been, that anywhere, in any parlor, a pair of clicking needles might be recording history, gave courage to many. It reminded people that even the gentlest among them, even those too old to fight, too frail to march, could still take part, quietly, cleverly, kindly. There is something beautiful in that thought, isn't there? That in a world of noise and machinery, the softest tools of all, wool and patience and a grandmother's steady hands, became instruments of resistance and love. So tonight, as you settle into your own warm blankets, think, just for a moment, of those quiet women by their firesides, the lamplight, the clicking needles, the hidden messages traveling through the world, tucked inside something soft enough to hold. And now let the rhythm of those needles carry you gently onward, tick, 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 like a slow, kindly heartbeat, down into rest, into sleep, into peace. Good night, and knit your dreams well. Let us settle in now and drift now together to a place where history and memory meet. A quiet field, somewhere between the trenches, where for one gentle moment in a long and difficult war, the sound of guns gave way to the sound of laughter and a ball being kicked across frozen grass. Our story begins in the winter of 1914. The world was in its first Great War, and young men from many lands found themselves far from home, living in long, cold ditches carved into the earth of France and Belgium. The nights were long, the air was damp and cold, and everything was quiet in a way that made the soldiers think of home. They thought of kitchens with warm bread. They thought of mothers singing softly. They thought of fields back home where, not so long ago, they had played football with their friends until the sky grew dark. And then, as December deepened, something remarkable began to happen. Along the lines, small lights appeared, little Christmas trees set carefully on the edges of the trenches, their candles flickering like distant stars. Voices drifted across the frozen ground, a carol here sung in one language, an answering carol there sung in another. The soldiers could not understand all the words, but they understood the melody. They understood the feeling. And slowly, courageously, one by one, men began to climb out of the trenches and stand in the open ground between them, a place that had a name that sounded frightening: No Man's Land. But on this night, it was not no man's land at all. It was everyone's land. It belonged to everyone who stood upon it with open hands and a peaceful heart. The soldiers met each other halfway, somewhere in the middle. They exchanged small gifts, buttons, bits of chocolate, tobacco, and warm words. They showed each other photographs of their families, their faces soft with homesickness and wonder. Some of them had been schoolboys together in other years, across borders, and now here they stood, smiling at one another in the pale winter light. And then came the football. No one knows exactly where the ball came from. Perhaps it was tucked into a soldier's pack. Perhaps it was improvised from rags and string. But soon, there it was, rolling across the frostbitten ground, and the young men, who only months before had been kicking balls in village squares and city parks, remembered exactly what to do. They marked out a goal with their greatcoats or with caps placed in the frozen grass. Teams were chosen, this side against that side, or perhaps simply everyone against everyone in a joyful tangle of boots and breath. The soldiers played in their heavy uniforms, their boots slipping a little on the hard ground, their breath rising in soft clouds in the cold air. Someone fell, someone laughed, someone's shot went wide of the coat that served as a goalpost, and cheers rose from both sides all the same. There was no referee, there was no score that mattered, though for years afterward, each side would smile and insist that they had won. And that is the most beautiful part, perhaps, that both sides could win, that for one afternoon, winning simply meant being there, on open ground, with the sun low and golden on the horizon, surrounded not by enemies, but by fellows. The ball flew back and forth across the field, and above it, the winter sky stretched pale and endless. For those few hours, the war seemed very far away, almost like a story someone had told long ago, half remembered, fading like morning mist. As evening came, the soldiers shook hands. They promised, some of them, to meet again, though many knew deep down that the world would pull them back. And it did. The match ended, and the men returned to their lines, but they carried something with them, a memory, warm as a coal in the pocket, that they would hold for the rest of their lives. That is why we call it the football match played in no man's land of memory, because the true field where that game was played was not just a patch of ground in France or Belgium. It was a place inside the human heart, a place where, even in the hardest winters, kindness can climb out of the trenches, walk slowly toward the other side, and find a hand waiting to be shaken. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine that field, the frost glittering like sugar in the last light, the sound of boots on frozen grass, of laughter carried on cold air, of a ball rising gently against a sky turning soft lavender and blue. Imagine men who had every reason to remain apart, choosing instead to meet in the middle. And let that image carry you down, slowly, gently, like a ball rolling to rest in the tall grass at the edge of a quiet field, as you breathe out and let go and rest. Good night, sleep softly, and dream of that one peaceful afternoon remembered forever. Welcome back, friend. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your breathing slow. Tonight we travel far north, to the frozen edge of the world, where the land meets the Arctic sky. And where, during the Second World War, a quiet group of guardians watched over America's coldest frontier. Picture Alaska in the early 1940s, a vast, silent wilderness of mountains, tundra, and frozen coastline. Villages of the Inupiat, Yupik, and Aleut peoples were scattered across this immense landscape, often hundreds of miles apart, connected only by rivers, dog trails, and the sea ice itself. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 and later occupied two small islands in Alaska's Aleutian chain, the United States suddenly realized how vulnerable its northern territory was. The long coastline, the remoteness, the endless stretches where no soldier could easily patrol. Someone who knew this land deeply would need to watch it. And so, in 1942, the Alaska Territorial Scout was born. The local people came to call them the Eskimo Scouts. Later, they would be formally organized as the Alaska Territorial Guard. But their spirit was always the same: quiet, patient, and remarkably capable. These were not soldiers in the usual sense. They were fishermen, hunters, trappers, and elders, men and women, young boys and grandfathers alike. More than 6,000 of them eventually volunteered, from the Arctic coast to the Aleutian Islands. They received little pay, sometimes just a formal discharge at war's end, but they gave something priceless: their eyes and their knowledge. The Scouts patrolled coastlines by kayak and fishing boat. They crossed the tundra by dog sled, carrying rifles and small radios. They watched the sea ice for strange vessels, listened for aircraft that shouldn't be there, mapped landing spots, water sources, and mountain passes, and reported everything to the army by radio in a language the enemy could never hope to understand. Their own native tongues, which proved to be an unbreakable code. Think of the conditions they endured: temperatures falling far below zero, storms that erased the horizon entirely, months of darkness. And yet the Scouts moved through it all with the calm confidence of people who had lived in harmony with this land for thousands of years. Where outside soldiers struggled simply to survive, the Scouts thrived, reading the snow, the wind, and the animal signs the way others read a newspaper. One of the most remarkable figures of this story is an elderly man named Nestor Malutin, and others like him, elders who, despite their age, took the oath and served faithfully. Some Scouts were in their 70s, some were teenagers. Age and background simply didn't matter, only willingness. The Alaska Territorial Guard would become, in a way, one of the most integrated military forces of its time. Natives, Aleuts, and even some white settlers serving side by side as equals. Their work was mostly invisible, a watchful presence rather than a fighting one. Japanese forces never launched the major invasion of mainland Alaska that planners feared, but historians agree the Scouts' vigilance mattered enormously. They were the eyes of a continent, the early warning system for the entire North Pacific. Some also helped rescue downed pilots, delivered supplies, guided army units through terrain no map could capture. One touching detail remains. Because of a technicality, the Scouts were not formally recognized as veterans until the year 2000, more than half a century later, when Congress finally granted them official veteran status. By then, only a few hundred of the original 6,000 were still alive. The last surviving Scout passed away in recent years, but their legacy endures in the Alaska National Guard, which carries on that lineage today. There is something deeply peaceful in this story, despite the war surrounding it. It reminds us that guardianship doesn't always mean battle. Sometimes it means standing quietly at the edge of things, watching, waiting, protecting home and family through patience and love of the land. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine the northern sky, green auroras rippling softly over the snow, a lone Scout wrapped in furs, dogs resting beside him, breathing visible in the cold air. He looks out over the frozen sea, sees nothing but stars and silence, and turns back toward his warm village, satisfied that all is well. The frontier was safe, the watch was kept, and the world slowly returned to peace. Rest now, friend, sleep well, and carry the quiet courage of the frozen frontier with you into your dreams. Tonight, let us drift far north together to the very top of the world, where the ice stretches endlessly and the sky lingers in shades of pearl and blue. Our story is a gentle one, about a lost airport built upon the ice of Greenland during the quiet, difficult years of the Second World War. In the early 1940s, the world was at war, and the great nations on either side of the Atlantic needed a way to reach one another. Airplanes were still young then, delicate machines with fabric wings and open cockpits, and they could not yet cross the vast ocean in a single flight. They needed resting places along the way, stepping stones across the water. There was one island that sat perfectly in the middle of this journey, Greenland, an immense land of white, mostly covered by an ice sheet deeper than mountains are tall. It was quiet there and remote, inhabited only along its coasts by small communities of hunters and fishers who had lived there for countless generations. But the skies above Greenland were becoming important. And so the idea was born, to build an airport not on land, not on rock, but on the ice itself. The place chosen was near a bay on the southwestern coast, where ships could bring supplies. The Americans called it WWII-era, and a companion field soon followed further north, WWII-era, an airport resting upon the frozen edge of the Great Ice Cap, near a settlement whose name meant the Great Fjord in the old Greenlandic tongue. Imagine the workers who arrived there, young men mostly, coming from warm American towns, stepping off ships into air so crisp it sparkled. They found a world of silence, glaciers groaning softly in the distance, snow reflecting the low golden sun, and in winter, nights that lasted for months, lit only by the moon and the slow dance of the aurora, green and violet ribbons unfurling overhead like curtains of light. Building an airport on ice was no small task. The frozen surface had to be graded and flattened, long runways pressed smooth into the snow. Steel mats were laid down in places. Simple buildings rose up, half buried in the snow for warmth, their roofs dusted white so that from the air, the whole base nearly disappeared into the landscape. A hidden airfield, camouflaged by the very season itself. The airport became a vital bridge. Weary transport planes would descend through the cold, thin air, their engines coughing, their pilots grateful for the long white runway below. Here they would rest, refuel, take warm food and a few hours of sleep in cots near pot-bellied stoves, before continuing eastward toward Europe or westward toward home. Weather reports from Greenland also helped guide the great convoys and flights across the ocean, for the weather there often foretold the weather everywhere else. Life at the ice airport had its own quiet rhythms. Men played cards by lamplight during the long polar night. They wrote letters home, describing skies unlike any they had ever seen. They learned to love, in their own way, the strange beauty of the place. The deep blue shadows on the ice at noon, the way sound carried for miles across the frozen stillness, the sudden brilliance of the sun reappearing in spring after months away. There were hardships, of course, winds that howled softly yet persistently for days, snowdrifts that swallowed buildings, cold that nipped at fingers and made every task slower. But there was also a profound peace in that remote outpost, a feeling of being at the edge of the world, far from the noise of battle, tucked into a landscape that had been sleeping under ice for 100,000 years. When the war ended, the great need for these frozen airfields faded. Slowly, the men packed their belongings, and one by one the transports left and did not return. The buildings were abandoned or dismantled, and the ice, patient as ever, began its quiet work. Drifting snow buried the foundations. The steel mats sank slowly into the glacier. Runways that once thundered with engines grew silent and smooth again. Then slowly crept and shifted with the moving ice, carrying the remnants of the airport deeper into the frozen landscape. Today, almost nothing remains visible. The lost airport has been gently swallowed by Greenland itself, a place remembered now only in old photographs, in the letters of men who once stood watch beneath the aurora, and in stories like this one. And so, as you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps picture that quiet place, a long white runway under a pale northern sky, snow drifting softly across the steel, the green lights of the aurora swaying above the ice. A forgotten airfield resting peacefully at the top of the world, waiting in the stillness, keeping its memories warm beneath the snow. Good night and sleep well. As the world settles into quiet night, let us drift back, gently, to the airfields of the 1940s, where an extraordinary and little-known group of women waited by hangar doors for the engines to cool. The women who tested airplanes. During the Second World War, the skies above America and Britain hummed with new machines. Factories turned out fighters and bombers by the thousands, but every aircraft had to be flown before it could serve. Someone had to take each new plane up into the morning mist, feel how it turned, listen to how it breathed, and report back, increasingly, that someone was a woman. In the United States, the Women Air Force Service pilots, the WASPs, flew in their soft leather jackets and quiet determination. Among them were ferry pilots like Jacqueline Cochran's recruits who carried new aircraft from factory to airfield across an entire continent. And at airbases everywhere, women test pilots coaxed fresh machines into the sky. They flew the gleaming Mustangs, the sturdy B-17s. Checking controls, testing engines, making certain each plane was safe for the young men who would fly them into history. In Britain, the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA, became famous for something remarkable. These pilots, many of them women, flew every kind of aircraft the Royal Air Force possessed, without radio, without instruments training on each new type, often navigating by maps resting on their laps and by landmarks far below. First Officer Anne Wood, Lettice Curtis, Maureen Dunlop, names spoken softly in the lore of aviation. They delivered thousands of Spitfires and Hurricanes, gliding from factory to squadron, one quiet flight at a time. Perhaps the gentlest and most fascinating figures were the women in the flight test offices themselves. At aircraft factories in England and America, female engineers and pilots tested modifications, a new propeller blade here, a patched fuel line there. They flew the same plane again and again, taking careful notes, describing in calm voices how it handled, whether it shivered in a turn, whether it climbed with ease. Their patience made the machines safer. Their silence kept them unnoticed by history for a long while. Imagine one of these mornings. The airfield grass is wet with dew. A woman in a wool flight suit walks slowly around a silver trainer aircraft, running her fingers along the wing's edge, checking the fabric, the rivets, the hinges. She swings up onto the wing, drops into the narrow cockpit, and settles her goggles. The propeller turns, coughs, then settles into a steady, soothing rhythm like a heartbeat. She taxis out beneath a peach-colored sky and lifts off so smoothly, the wheels barely seem to leave the grass. Up there above the clouds and the noise of the world, she is alone with the machine. She tests it gently, climbing, banking, easing the nose down, feeling for anything unusual. There is no enemy here, no fear in this telling, only the hum of the engine, the white clouds drifting past, and her careful hands and attentive mind. When she lands, she writes her notes in tidy handwriting, and another aircraft is declared ready. These women flew without much recognition. The WASPs, in particular, received no military status for their service during the war, a quiet injustice that was set right only decades later, when they were finally honored with veteran status in 1977, and later the Congressional Gold Medal. By then, many had grown old, but the memory of those calm mornings aloft never left them. 38 WASP pilots gave their lives in service. The ATA women also lost friends along the way. We remember them tonight not with sorrow, but with soft gratitude, for they flew so that others might fly safely. They proved, quietly and completely, that skill and courage wear no single face. And so, as you drift towards sleep, picture one of them one last time. A young woman sitting on the wing of her aircraft at dusk, helmet in her lap, watching the sun melt slowly behind the hangars. The engine ticks as it cools. The day is done. Somewhere far away, a plane she tested is flying safely home. Her work is quiet now, like the airfield, like the evening, like you letting go of the day. Rest well and let the gentle hum of those old propellers carry you softly into your dreams. Tonight, let us drift back to a corner of the Second World War. A story not of battles, but of something wonderfully strange. Ships made of concrete. Yes, concrete. The same sturdy material that builds sidewalks and bridges was, for a time, called upon to carry sailors across the sea. It sounds almost like a dream, doesn't it? Great grey vessels, floating quietly on the ocean, built from stone and sand. To understand how this came to be, we must first imagine the world of the early 20th century. Steel was precious. Nations needed it for trains, for buildings, for weapons. And during times of war, steel became scarcer still, like flour during a famine or firewood in a long winter. Shipbuilders watched their supplies dwindle, and they began to wonder, what else could float? The idea was not entirely new. In France, in the mid-1800s, a gentleman named Joseph Louis Lambot had experimented with small boats made of wire and cement. Others followed over the decades, curious and patient. But it was during the World Wars, when steel grew scarce, that the concrete ship truly came into its own. You see, concrete has some gentle virtues. It does not rust the way steel does. It resists fire, and it can be molded and shaped while still soft, like clay, allowing workers to pour great holes in forms, almost the way one might bake a loaf of bread. Most importantly, when reinforced with steel bars inside, a mesh of strength hidden within, rather like the bones beneath your skin, concrete could hold together surprisingly well. The trick, of course, was weight. Stone wants to sink, so the engineers had to be clever. The hulls were made thin and smooth, shaped carefully so that the vessel displaced enough water to stay buoyant, the way a smooth pebble skips across a pond if thrown just right. And because concrete ships had no engines of their own, mostly, they were often towed gently across the seas, trailing behind tugboats like calm, patient companions. During the First World War, the United States built a fleet of these vessels, and by the time the Second World War arrived, the idea returned once more. Steel was needed elsewhere, so concrete ships were built again, barges, tugs, and transports. They carried supplies, fuel, and equipment. Some served in the invasions of Normandy, floating steadily toward the beaches as part of the great artificial harbors that helped supply the Allied forces. Imagine standing on the deck of one of these vessels on a quiet evening, the sea lapping softly against thick concrete walls, the horizon turning shades of lavender and gold. The ship rode lower in the water than her steel cousins, and she moved more slowly, with a certain unhurried grace. Sailors said these ships felt solid beneath their feet, steady, dependable, like standing on a pier that happened to be crossing the ocean. One of the most famous of these vessels, the SS Selma, still rests today in Galveston, Texas, a great concrete hulk half-submerged in the shallows, her silhouette soft against the water. She never saw war herself, but she remains as a gentle reminder of that inventive era. Birds settle on her decks now. The tide rises and falls around her, and she endures, unbothered by the rust that would have claimed a steel ship long ago. In England, there was the SS Cretfield and others, and along the Thames you might still find a concrete barge or two, moored and mossy, holding their secrets. Some concrete ships were scuttled deliberately, sunk on purpose, to form breakwaters and artificial reefs. Off the coast of Canada and in the Pacific, these quiet giants still lie beneath the waves, their hulls now home to fish and swaying kelp, serving the sea in a new and peaceful way. There is something poetic about it, isn't there? Ships meant for war that ended their days as sanctuaries for marine life, concrete bones becoming coral gardens. The concrete ships were never fast, they were never glamorous, but they did their work quietly and well during a time when the world needed every vessel it could find. They remind us that human ingenuity often flourishes under constraint, that when the usual materials run short, we find new answers in old stones. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, Perhaps picture one of these improbable vessels, gliding slowly across a calm sea under a silver moon, her concrete hull smooth and cool, carrying her cargo patiently toward the far shore. The waves whisper against her sides. The engine of a tugboat hums somewhere ahead, and the great stone ship moves on, steady and serene, through the gentle dark. Rest now and let the quiet sea carry you gently into dreams. Tonight, let us drift back to the winter of 1944 and discover a strange, quiet chapter of the Second World War. A story not of battles, but of envelopes, stamps, and the gentle, persistent power of paper. As the war in Europe moved toward its close, the Allied forces fought not only with soldiers and machines, but with something far softer: words. There was a special branch of the American military, known as the Office of War Information, and within its psychological warfare division, people worked long, thoughtful hours in London offices. Their weapons were leaflets, radio broadcasts, and pamphlets. Small paper messages intended to drift across enemy lines like autumn leaves and whisper a simple idea to ordinary German citizens. The war was ending, and surrender was not a disgrace, but a mercy. But there was a problem, a quiet, frustrating one. Many of these leaflets, dropped from airplanes by the millions, never reached the hands they were meant for. German police and party officials collected them quickly. Citizens who picked them up sometimes turned them in out of fear. A leaflet lying in the street was a dangerous thing to be seen reading. And so, one cold winter, a clever idea took shape. An idea that would come to be known, quite charmingly, as Operation Cornflakes. The thinking went like this: what if the propaganda didn't fall from the sky at all? What if, instead, it arrived the way letters normally do, quietly through the mail, carried not by enemy planes, but by Germany's own postal service? A letter sitting on the breakfast table, tucked among the ordinary mail, would not be feared. It would simply be opened, the way we open a letter from a friend. The plan required patience and remarkable attention to detail. In Italy, at a large American facility, workers prepared special envelopes. They were designed to look exactly like legitimate German business mail: correct paper, correct formatting, even carefully forged German stamps, printed in Rome to match the originals down to the perforations and the gum on the back. Inside each envelope sat a folded leaflet or small booklet bearing news of Germany's situation. Honest reporting of defeats and shortages that German newspapers would never print. The addresses on these envelopes were taken from genuine captured mailing lists, membership rosters, subscriber lists, and business directories that had fallen into Allied hands. Each envelope was addressed to a real person, at a real address, in a real German town. Then came the delicate part: the delivery. The envelopes could not simply be dropped anywhere. They needed to land near a railway station or a mail sorting point, so that when the local postal workers came out each morning to sweep up and sort the mail bags, they would gather these letters along with the genuine ones. And believing them to be ordinary delayed mail from a disrupted train route, send them onward into the German postal system. From there, the letters would travel calmly, unnoticed, into homes and offices across the country. On a cold morning in early February 1945, the operation began. Airplanes flew over Austrian and German towns, and instead of bombing them, they released bundles of these carefully crafted mailbags, timed to burst open just above the ground near the stations. The bags scattered envelopes across the platforms and streets, and each morning, true to plan, the postal workers dutifully swept them up and sorted them along with everything else. It worked by all accounts rather beautifully. Tens of thousands of these letters slipped into the German mail stream, passing through the hands of German postal clerks, riding German trains, and arriving on German breakfast tables, where someone, perhaps a tired shopkeeper or a worried mother, would open an ordinary-looking envelope and find a quiet, honest account of how the war was truly going. The name Operation Cornflakes carried a gentle humor, for the letters arrived, quite literally, at the breakfast table, right beside the morning cereal. There is something almost poetic about it, a weapon designed to be read over tea and toast in the soft light of an early morning kitchen. Historians still debate how much such paper truly changed hearts and minds. Wars are not won by leaflets alone, but Operation Cornflakes remains a lovely example of ingenuity without violence. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, there were people who believed that a folded piece of paper, delivered gently through an ordinary mail slot, could carry more weight than thunder. And so tonight, as you settle into your own warm blankets, think for a moment of those winter mornings long ago, of snow-covered railway platforms, of mailbags drifting down like strange grey birds, of quiet postal workers sweeping letters into sacks, unaware that each envelope held a whisper of peace, and of someone, somewhere, opening it slowly by candlelight and letting hope in through the flap of an envelope. Sleep well and let the story carry you gently into rest. Close your eyes, settle into your pillows, and let your breathing grow slow and easy, because tonight I want to tell you a quiet story. A story about a curious machine and a group of gentle thinkers who lived and worked in the English countryside, solving puzzles that helped shape the world. Our story begins with a machine called the Enigma. Picture a wooden box about the size of a small typewriter, with keys like a keyboard and a row of little round wheels inside called rotors. When someone pressed a key, an electric current traveled through those turning wheels and lit up a letter on a small lamp board. But here was the clever part. The wheels shifted with every single press, so the same letter never meant the same thing twice. Press A once, and it might become G. Press it again, and it might become T. The Enigma machine was used to send secret messages across Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. There were millions upon millions of possible settings, so many that many people believed no one could ever read its messages. The machine hummed quietly in offices and ships and stations, writing its dancing, unreadable letters day after day. But some people did not believe it was unbreakable. In Poland, before the war, mathematicians like Marian Rejewski studied the machine with great patience and care. They worked through the mathematics step by step, like solving a very long riddle, and they built early machines that could search for the daily settings. Their work was quiet, careful, and deeply thoughtful, and when the war came, they shared everything they had learned with others so the puzzle solving could continue. And so we traveled to England, to a quiet place called Bletchley Park. It was a country estate, not far from London, with red brick buildings, tall trees, and a lake where ducks drifted along in the mornings. Behind its calm walls, an extraordinary community gathered: mathematicians, crossword enthusiasts, linguists, chess players, and many, many young women who worked as operators, listening and typing and sorting. Among them was a young mathematician named Alan Turing, a thoughtful, somewhat shy man who loved long runs through the countryside and curious questions about thinking itself. He and his colleagues worked in humble wooden huts, Hut 6, Hut 8, rooms that were often chilly, filled with the soft clicking of typewriters and the murmur of quiet conversation. Tea was never far away. People wrapped themselves in scarves and focused on the work with great gentleness and great determination. Together they built machines called bombs, tall cabinets with round drums arranged in rows that turned and turned, checking possibilities one after another. Imagine the sound, a soft, rhythmic whirring, like many clocks all breathing together. The machine did not think like a person. It simply searched patiently through the enormous garden of possible settings until something fit, until the scrambled letters suddenly settled into ordinary words. Breaking a message was like tuning an old radio through static. At first, only noise, meaningless letters tumbling past, then a familiar word would appear, maybe a weather report, which always began in the same way, and the codebreakers would lean in, adjusting, testing, narrowing down, and then, all at once, a whole message would bloom into plain language, as if fog had lifted from a meadow at sunrise. The messages they read helped ships find safer routes across the seas, helped planners make wiser choices, and historians tell us, shortened the war by years and saved many, many lives. Yet for a very long time, none of it was spoken about. The people of Bletchley Park kept their secret for decades. They returned home, raised families, and carried the story quietly inside them, like letters sealed in an envelope. What a gentle thing to imagine, isn't it? A whole community of quiet people in a quiet country house doing work that no one could ever know about. No trumpets, no applause, just patient minds, warm mugs of tea, and the soft turning of wheels. And there is something else to hold on to as you drift towards sleep. The Enigma story reminds us that curiosity is a kind of kindness, that thinking carefully, patiently together can be one of the most powerful acts there is. The mathematicians next door didn't conquer anything with force. They simply refused to give up on a puzzle, and they let their minds wander methodically through every possibility until the answer revealed itself. So tonight, as you rest, picture that English estate, the lake catching the last soft light, the huts glowing faintly warm in the dusk, papers rustling, wheels turning slowly, and somewhere a kettle beginning to sing. The world outside was uncertain, but inside there was order, purpose, and quiet hope. Let your own thoughts slow down now, like those rotors coming gently to rest. There is nothing left to solve tonight. The puzzle of the day is finished, and the answers can wait until morning. Breathe in softly and out again, and let yourself drift, calm and safe, into a long and peaceful sleep. Tonight, let us drift back to another time, to the London of the 1940s, when the city itself began to bloom in the most unexpected places. This is the story of the Victory allotments, the gardens at war. When the Second World War began, Britain found itself far from home soil. The ships that once carried food across the oceans, oranges from distant groves, wheat from faraway plains, were now threatened, delayed, or diverted by the demands of war. Rationing arrived, gentle but firm, and families learned to measure their butter, their sugar, their eggs in small, careful amounts. And yet, something remarkable happened. Rather than worry, the people of London looked down at the earth beneath their feet and decided to grow. The government called it the Dig for Victory campaign. Posters appeared, a cheerful soldier standing in a vegetable patch, his rifle resting against a garden fence, a spade in his hand. The message was simple and kind: grow your own and you help your country. And so, all across London, the city began to change. Lawns became potato beds. Flower borders gave way to rows of cabbages, onions, and beans. The moat of the Tower of London, that ancient water surrounding the old stone fortress, was planted with vegetables for the very first time in centuries. Hyde Park opened patches to eager gardeners. Even the grounds of Buckingham Palace were turned over to cabbages and root vegetables. The royal household, like everyone else, learned the quiet satisfaction of watching things grow. Allotments, small plots of shared land, had existed in England for a long time, dating back to the Victorian era, when city dwellers with no gardens of their own could rent a little piece of countryside within the town. But never before had they been so important, so busy, so beloved. By the middle of the war, there were more than 1.5 million allotments across Britain, many of them right in the heart of London. Imagine the scene on a soft summer morning. A woman in a headscarf bends over her runner beans, her fingers working the soil. An elderly man, a veteran of an earlier war, tenderly ties up his tomato plants, whistling an old tune. Children, some evacuated to the countryside and some who stayed, chase butterflies between the rows of carrots while their parents trade gardening advice over the fence. Seeds are shared, tools are lent. A neighbor shows a newcomer how to protect the cabbages from slugs, and in return receives a bundle of fresh mint for tea. There was a rhythm to it all, a gentle order. In spring, the digging and the planting, the smell of turned earth cool and rich. In summer, the weeding and watering in the long golden evenings after work. In autumn, the harvest, potatoes pulled from the dark soil like little treasures, apples stored in cool cupboards, onions strung in braids to hang in kitchens across the city. Jams were made from hedgerow berries, preserves filled the pantries. The harvest festivals of those years were small and heartfelt, celebrating what ordinary hands had grown. And these gardens gave more than food, they gave peace. In a city sometimes shaken by distant events, the allotments were quiet sanctuaries, places of routine and hope. Kneeling in the soil, watching a seed push its way toward the light, a person could feel that the future was still certain, that spring would still come, that goodness still grew. Doctors and officials of the time even noted how much healthier people seemed. Stronger, calmer, fed on fresh vegetables and warmed by purpose. By the end of the war, home gardens and allotments were producing a remarkable share of the nation's vegetables, nearly half by some accounts. The city had fed itself in its own quiet way, and the people had discovered a deep, enduring love for the soil. After the war ended, many of these gardens returned to lawns and parks. Though some remain to this day, green patches tucked between London streets, worked by gardeners who may not know that their leafy plots were once part of a nation's quiet triumph. The story of the Victory allotments reminds us of something gentle and true, that even in the hardest times, people can create beauty and nourishment together, that a small plot of earth, tended patiently, can hold a whole community together, and that sometimes the bravest thing of all is simply to plant a seed and tend it day by day in hope. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, picture those London gardens, the soft evening light on the bean rows, the smell of mint and earth, the low hum of neighbors' voices, and let yourself rest like a garden after a day of sunshine, calm, quiet, and growing slowly toward the morning. Tonight we drift gently back in time, to the middle years of the Second World War, and to a quiet, curious corner of history that unfolded high above the Pacific Ocean. This is the story of the balloon bombs, the strange paper balloons that crossed the world's largest ocean, carried not by engines or machines, but by the patient breath of the wind itself. Picture the scene. It is the early 1940s, and the war has drawn many nations into its grasp. On the other side of the Pacific, in Japan, scientists and engineers faced a puzzling problem. The ocean between them and the North American continent was vast. Thousands upon thousands of miles of open water, too wide for planes to cross and return safely, too wide for ships to slip across unnoticed. And so they looked upward to the sky and wondered if the wind itself might carry their message across the sea. There is a river in the sky, you see. Scientists call it the jet stream, a powerful, invisible current of air that flows steadily from west to east, high above the earth, far above the clouds where ordinary weather is made. In those years, few people in the world knew much about it, but Japanese scientists had studied it carefully, and they believed that if they could lift their devices into that high, swift river of wind, it would carry them quietly across the ocean, all the way to North America. And so they began to build balloons. These were not the bright, cheerful balloons of a fairground. These were enormous, over 30 feet across when fully inflated, and made from delicate layers of paper, crafted from the fibers of the mulberry tree, pasted together by hand. Hundreds of workers, many of them schoolchildren and their families, spent long, patient hours gluing paper panels together with a paste made from a vegetable called konnyaku. It was slow, careful work. A little like the paper lanterns and kites of old tradition, now serving a new and serious purpose. Each balloon carried a small ring of sandbags hanging beneath it, and a simple little device, an altimeter, that watched how high the balloon floated. When the balloon rose too high in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere, a small charge would release one or two of the sandbags, letting the balloon drift lower again. Slowly, night and day, the sandbags fell away one by one into the empty ocean below, and the balloon continued eastward, riding the dark and silent highway of the wind. The journey took about 3 days, 3 quiet days of drifting above the clouds, past storms and starlight, until at last the last sandbags were released, and the balloon came down gently somewhere on the far side of the ocean, in the forests, fields, and mountains of Western Canada and the United States. Beginning in late 1944, these balloons began to arrive. Forestry workers found them tangled in tall pines. Farmers found them resting in snowy fields. Many more came down where no one ever saw them at all, sinking softly into deep forests or settling onto remote hillsides where the rain and the moss slowly folded them into the landscape. In all, it is believed that some 9,000 balloons were launched, and only a few hundred were ever found. News of these arrivals was treated with great care. Governments asked newspapers and radio stations not to report the findings, worried that the balloons' makers would learn whether their plan had worked. And so, quietly and calmly, officials and volunteers gathered up the balloons where they were found, studied them, and tucked them away. In time, the balloons simply stopped coming. The wind patterns shifted with the seasons, and by the spring of 1945, the launches had ended. Looking back now, the balloon bombs stand as one of the strangest episodes of the war, a plan that relied entirely on patience, paper, and the quiet movement of the atmosphere. In a way, they remind us of something rather gentle, that the sky above us is not empty, but alive with currents and rivers of air, flowing day and night whether we notice them or not. Carrying seeds and birds and weather, and once, for a brief few months, a fleet of quiet paper voyagers drifting east toward the rising sun. Tonight, as you settle into rest, perhaps you can imagine it all. The great paper spheres rising into the cool evening air, catching the invisible river of wind, gliding high above the gray and silver ocean, while below the waves roll on and the world turns slowly beneath them. It is a strange little story from a difficult time, but told softly, it becomes something almost peaceful. A reminder that even in the middle of great events, the sky keeps its own quiet rhythms. And carries on, unhurried as it always has. Rest now and let the wind carry you gently off to sleep. Settle in and let the night grow and quiet around you. Tonight's story comes from the spring of 1944, from the green hills of southern England, where the greatest seaborne invasion in history was being prepared, not with thunder and fury, but with paper, pencils, and very tired typists. By April of that year, the plan for the Normandy landings had grown into something almost beyond imagining. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tides, moonlight, wind, and weather all had to agree before a single boot touched a single beach, and all of that enormous effort rested, in the end, on ordinary pieces of paper, typed, copied, sealed, and carried between quiet offices behind brick walls and blackout curtains. In one of those offices worked a young clerical officer. Let us simply call him Thomas, a careful, soft-spoken man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of reading everything twice. His job was not glamorous. He checked documents. He compared copies against originals, page by page, line by line, number by number. It was the kind of work that could make a person's eyes ache, but Thomas believed quietly that small things mattered. One evening, well past dusk, he was reviewing a typed set of orders, supporting documents meant to coordinate the movement of naval forces toward the French coast. The lamps were low, as they always were, to keep the light from escaping through the windows. The room smelled of paper and cold tea. Outside, a gentle rain tapped against the glass. And there, in a table of coordinates and timings, Thomas noticed something that made him stop and read the line a third time. A single transposed figure, a wrong number where a right one should have been, a typographical error so small that a hurried reader would slide right past it. But if that line had gone unchecked, ships would have been given a position that didn't match the rest of the plan. Vessels arriving in the dark hours before dawn might have found themselves kilometers from where they were meant to be, perhaps in the path of other forces, perhaps in waters that were mined. Perhaps simply out of place, when every minute was to matter so very much. Thomas didn't panic. He was far too tired for panic, and far too calm by nature. He simply marked the page, set it in the correct tray, and noted it in his log with neat, patient handwriting. Then he walked, in the damp evening air, to the office of a senior staff officer, a weary man with grey at his temples who was working by lamplight over maps weighted down with teacups. The officer read the line. He read it again, and then he sat back slowly in his chair because he understood what Thomas understood, that a single keystroke by some anonymous clerk working late in another building had placed a thread slightly out of true in a fabric woven from a million threads. And when a fabric is stretched across an entire channel, across an entire night, even one thread out of place can pull. The discovery traveled upward, quietly and firmly, the way important things do. Sections of the plan were re-verified, copies were recalled and checked, typists were asked kindly to work a little slower, and for a short window of time, the invasion schedule itself was held under review, shifted and adjusted, not because of weather or enemy action or some grand strategic dilemma, but because of one small, mistaken character on one sheet of paper. When the landings finally came, in the first days of June, under a sky of broken cloud and a wind that finally softened, the ships found their places in the darkness, more or less as intended. History remembers the beaches, the courage, the long freight of that morning. It does not often remember Thomas, or the lamplight, or the quiet correcting of a transposed number. But that is rather the point of the story, isn't it? That history is not only made by generals and grand decisions, it is made in small rooms by careful people checking things twice. A single letter, a single digit, held the power to bend the plans of nations, and it was caught not by brilliance, but by patience, by someone willing to read a dull document one more time when no one would ever know. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps take a small comfort in that thought, that the world quietly depends on unnoticed carefulness, on the patient hands and steady eyes of people who will never be remembered, and that even the largest events in history can turn upon something as small and as human as a tiny mistake on a page, gently caught and gently mended. Rest well now, and let the lamplight of that long-ago office grow dim and soft and still. Close your eyes if you like and settle into the warmth of your blankets, because tonight we're going to drift back through time to a story of quiet kindness amid a world at war. This is the story of the hospitals that never turned anyone away. During the Second World War, when so much of the world was divided, by borders, by uniforms, by the side of a line someone happened to be born on, there were places where those lines simply faded away. Hospitals, some grand, some small, tucked into converted mansions, village schools, even country estates with roses still climbing their garden walls. Picture one of these places for a moment, a long room with high windows, evening light falling in soft amber stripes across rows of neat white beds. There's a hush here, but not an empty hush, a gentle, living hush. The rustle of a nurse's apron as she moves between beds, the quiet clink of a spoon against a teacup. Somewhere, someone humming an old tune, barely audible. In these hospitals, something remarkable was happening. A soldier from one nation might lie in a bed beside a soldier from another, and a civilian family displaced by shifting frontiers might rest nearby too. The rules were simple and quietly radical. If you were wounded, if you were ill, if you were suffering, you would be cared for. That was all. No forms asking which side you belonged to. No questions meant to divide, just care. The nurses and doctors who worked in these places came from everywhere. Some had traveled great distances to volunteer. Some were local women who had learned to bandage and comfort in a matter of weeks. Others were elderly doctors, long retired, who returned to their wards with spectacles pushed up on their foreheads and steady, practiced hands. They worked long hours, and yet visitors often remembered something surprising about them. Not exhaustion, though there was plenty of that, but gentleness. A calm in their voices that made the whole ward feel steadier. There was a rhythm to these hospital days. Morning began with soft light and the drawing back of curtains, a few inches at a time so no one woke too suddenly. Then came washing, warm water in basins, the small dignities of a sponge and a clean pillowcase. Breakfast arrived on trays, porridge, bread, tea with milk. And through it all, the nurses moved like quiet currents, checking bandages, adjusting blankets, offering a word here, a smile there. Afternoons were for healing in other ways. Volunteers brought books and read aloud to those whose eyes were bandaged. Musicians sometimes came to play in courtyards, the notes drifting up through open windows. Children who had taken shelter in one hospital became something like mascots, adopted by nurses and patients alike, learning card games from recovering soldiers, drawing pictures with stubs of pencil on the backs of old newspapers. And when night fell, the wards grew hushed. A night nurse made her rounds with a small shaded lamp, its glow no brighter than a candle flame. She paused at each bed, listening to the gentle sound of breathing. She smoothed a blanket here, refilled a water glass there, and sometimes, when someone stirred uneasily in their sleep, she simply stood beside them a moment, a calm presence in the dark, until they settled again. Some of these hospitals were run by orders of nursing sisters whose traditions of care stretch back generations. Others were improvised, a rare thing born of pure necessity, operating tables under high ceilings in buildings that had been ballrooms or libraries just months before. Yet in all of them, the same spirit prevailed. The wounded were washed, fed, and rested. Privacy was preserved with curtains drawn around beds. Letters were written for those whose hands could not yet hold a pen. Careful, patient letters home. There is something worth pausing over in that. In a time when the world insisted on sorting people into categories, these hospitals quietly declined. Compassion, they seem to say, does not check papers. Kindness does not ask which uniform you wore or which village you fled from. It only asks, are you hurting? Then come in. There is a bed. There is warm water. There is time. And perhaps that is why, decades later, people who were patients in those wards, often as children or young soldiers far from home, still spoke of them with such softness, not as places of war at all, but as islands, places where, for a little while, the world was made gentle again, where a stranger's hands became a comfort, where sleep came easier because someone was watching over you. Tonight, as you drift off, you might carry a little of that feeling with you, the sense of being watched over, the sense that kindness, quiet and steady, endures even through the hardest of times. The wards are hushed now, the shaded lamps glow low, and somewhere in the past, a night nurse makes her gentle rounds, and all is calm. Rest well and sleep peacefully. Close your eyes, if you wish, and settle into the softness of the evening, and let us drift back, gently, to a time before the sky could be seen in the dark. Imagine the world of the 1930s. The night sky above the oceans and the countrysides of Europe was, in those days, a mystery. Once the sun set, the darkness swallowed everything. Airplanes, those marvels of the age, could climb into the clouds and simply vanish. There was no way to see them coming. The only warnings were human ears, listeners straining at the edges of towns, hoping to catch the faint hum of distant engines in the night air. These people were called sound locators, giant horn-shaped listening devices, curved like elegant trumpets pointed toward the heavens. Young men and women stood beside them in the cold, tilting the great cones slowly, listening for the whisper of propellers. It was patient, quiet work, fragile work, for as aircraft grew faster, the sound of their engines arrived far too late. The plane had already passed by the time its echo reached the listener's ear. And so, quietly, in laboratories and coastal stations, a handful of scientists began to wonder, could light, or something like light, be sent out into the darkness and made to come back? In Britain, in the winter of 1934, the Air Ministry received a curious proposal. A man named Robert Watson Watt, a descendant, some say, of the inventor of the steam engine, was asked whether a death ray might be built, some beam powerful enough to stop an aircraft in the sky. He thought carefully and replied with gentle honesty, no such ray was possible. But he added softly, there was something else. Radio waves could find an aircraft. They could touch it, far away in the mist, and return with news of its presence. Not a weapon, but a way of seeing. And so began one of the most secret and remarkable endeavors of the age. The word they eventually gave it was radar, short letters standing for a long idea, radio detection and ranging. In essence, it was wonderfully simple. A transmitter would send out a pulse of radio energy, an invisible ripple traveling at the speed of light. If that ripple touched something solid, a plane, a ship, a cloud heavy with rain, a tiny fragment of it would bounce back. The station would listen for that faint returning whisper and measure how long the journey took. From that small silence between sending and receiving, one could know how far away the object was and in which direction it flew. The first experiments were humble. Along the Thames estuary, tall wooden towers rose above the marshes, strange skeletal structures, 240 feet high, humming with quiet purpose. On February the 26th, 1935, a test was arranged. A bomber was asked to fly out toward the sea, and the new apparatus waited at a place called Daventry. The equipment was delicate, half-assembled, tucked inside a van. And yet, as the plane flew, the needle on the paper chart began to move. A faint pulse appeared, again and again, marking the aircraft's passage. Those present watched in silence. The darkness, for the first time in history, had been parted. Over the following years, a chain of these stations grew along Britain's eastern and southern coasts, the chain home system. Tall steel towers, wires strung between them like the strings of an enormous instrument. By 1939, they stood watch through every night and every storm. Operators, many of them young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, sat in dim rooms, watching screens that painted the sky in slow, glowing sweeps of green. Each small blip of light was a distant aircraft. And each blip meant that someone somewhere would be given time. Time to prepare, time to warn, time to simply breathe. It is a gentle thing, in a way, to reflect upon. Radar never sought to harm anyone. It was, at its heart, a technology of attention, of listening, of noticing, of paying careful witness to the world. Its echoes traveled out into the darkness and returned with quiet truths. And that idea, born on windswept coastal marshes in the years before the war, did not end with the war. The same gentle principle now guides airliners safely across oceans, helps sailors find their way home through fog, and lets meteorologists watch the approach of rain across a sleeping countryside. Every weather map you have ever seen carries, in its way, an echo of those first towers above the Thames. So tonight, as you drift toward rest, imagine those early operators in their quiet rooms, the soft sweep of a glowing screen, and the patient rhythm of a signal sent into the vast dark sky, always faithfully returning home. And now let yourself return too, gently, softly, into sleep. Tonight, let us journey back gently to the winter months of 1938 and 1939, to a story of quiet courage, a story about a train and the children who rode it to safety. In those years, long before any of us were born, the world was a worried place. Storm clouds of war were gathering over Europe, and in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, many families lived in fear. There were mothers and fathers who knew, deep in their hearts, that the safest place for their children was far, far away from home. And so a remarkable thing began. It was called the Kindertransport, which simply means, in German, the children's transport. Between December of 1938 and the summer of 1939, trains began to leave from stations in Berlin, Vienna, Prague, and other cities. Trains bound for Britain, a small island nation that had agreed to open its doors. Imagine, if you can, one of those station platforms on a cold morning. Steam rising softly from the engine, drifting upward like breath on a winter's day. The platform busy but hushed. Children dressed in their warmest coats, each one allowed to bring only a small suitcase. A few clothes, perhaps a favorite book, a photograph of family, maybe a beloved toy tucked carefully at the bottom. The parents stood close, smoothing their children's hair, whispering last words of love. "Promise me you'll be good. Write to me when you can. Be brave, my darling, be brave." And then the whistle would sound, soft at first, then clearer, and the children would climb aboard, waving through the windows with small gloved hands. The trains rolled westward and northward, through the countryside, past frozen fields and sleeping villages, across borders and over great rivers. Some journeys took a day, some took longer, winding through Holland, where the children crossed the North Sea by ferry before continuing on to England by rail. Through the windows, the children watched the world change around them. The language on the signs, the shape of the rooftops, the color of the light. Nearly 10,000 children made that journey, 10,000 small suitcases, 10,000 brave goodbyes. When they arrived in Britain, they were met by kind volunteers at the stations, people who had prepared homes for them, Some children went to live with families, some to hostels, some to farms in the countryside. It was not always easy. The food was different. The language was strange at first. And the children missed their mothers and fathers terribly, especially at night when the houses grew quiet. But there was kindness, too, everywhere. There were the organizers, people like Nicholas Winton, a quiet young man who worked tirelessly from his desk in London, arranging papers and homes for hundreds of children from Prague. He did not speak of it much afterward. For nearly 50 years, most people never knew what he had done. Such is often the way of true goodness. It does not seek attention, it simply acts. And there were the guardians and foster parents, the teachers and neighbors who helped these children feel safe again. Slowly, the children learned new words. They made friends. They went to school. They grew. And though their hearts carried a gentle ache for home, they also carried hope. The trains stopped when the war began in September of 1939, the last transports having just made it through. Many of the parents who waved goodbye that day were never able to join their children. It is a sad truth, and we hold it softly tonight. But the story remains, above all, one of rescue, of ordinary people choosing, again and again, to do something kind in a difficult time. Today, the children of that railway are grandparents and great-grandparents. Some have shared their memories in books and interviews so that we might remember. In museums, you can still see the small suitcases, the worn identity tags the children wore around their necks, little cardboard labels with numbers and names. So as you settle into sleep tonight, let this image stay with you. A train moving steadily through a winter landscape, its windows warm with lamplight, carrying precious cargo, not gold or treasure, but children, carried towards safety by the quiet kindness of strangers. And perhaps, as your own eyes grow heavy, you can rest with the thought that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were always hands reaching out, always people willing to help, always a light in the window at journey's end. The train carried them safely, the kindness endured, and now it is time to rest. Good night. Tonight, let us drift back to the quiet fields of England during the Second World War and discover a story that is gentle in its telling, yet remarkable in its cleverness. The story of Decoy airfields and the little wooden airplanes that guarded the skies by pretending to be real. As the war settled over Europe, and later as American airfields multiplied across the countryside, a curious problem emerged. Enemy aircraft, flying under the cover of darkness, searched for airbases to attack. Real airfields, with their valuable runways, hangars, and aircraft, were precious things, and protecting them became an art form all its own. The answer, perhaps surprisingly, came not from weapons, but from imagination. Military planners, artists, and even film set designers were brought together to create something called deception, or as some called it, camouflage on a grand scale. Across the rolling fields and moonlit pastures, they began to build airfields that were not airfields at all. They were illusions, carefully crafted, softly glowing, and entirely made of pretend. These decoy sites were known by quiet names like starfish sites in Britain, named after the sea creature that scatters its arms in many directions, much like the decoys themselves, scattered across the landscape to draw attention away from the true targets. At night, workers would light small fires and arrange lamps in patterns that mimicked a real airfield from high above. The flickering runway lights, the glow of a control tower, even the smudge of fake cooking fires drifting smoke into the evening air. And then there were the planes themselves, the delightful wooden aircraft. Carpenters and craftsmen, many of whom had spent their lives building theater sets or furniture, now turned their hands to creating aeroplanes out of timber, wire, and painted canvas. These little wooden bombers and fighters were shaped with care. Rounded fuselages, gentle wings, even painted markings copied from real squadrons. From a distance, or from the window of a passing aircraft at night, they looked convincingly real. The idea was simple and rather poetic. If an enemy pilot saw a field full of aircraft, they would drop their bombs there, believing they had struck a valuable target. The bombs would fall harmlessly upon wooden frames and empty grass, while the real planes, parked safely elsewhere, remained untouched. In a way, the wooden planes served as quiet guardians, sacrificing themselves in pretend so that others might survive in truth. People who built and operated these decays were often ordinary folk: farmers, volunteers, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and local laborers. They worked in the hush of twilight, lighting lamps, moving props, and adjusting their illusions as the war shifted around them. Some of them had been scenery painters or set builders before the war, and they brought with them the same patience and artistry they had once used for the stage. There was something almost theatrical about the whole enterprise. A play performed for an audience flying miles overhead in the dark. And remarkably, it worked. Decoy airfields drew hundreds of bombing raids away from real bases over the course of the war. Records suggest that thousands of bombs fell on sites that held nothing but wood, canvas, and carefully placed lights. Each bomb that struck a decoy was a bomb that did not strike a hangar, a runway, or the people working nearby. It is a quiet statistic, but a deeply comforting one. A reminder that cleverness and creativity can be their own kind of protection. There were small details that made these deceptions feel almost charming. Fake crews would sometimes walk among the wooden planes at dusk so that their silhouettes would seem lifelike. Trucks made of canvas stretched over frames would trundle slowly across pretend roads. Even the sounds of an airfield, engine noises, radio chatter, were sometimes reproduced to complete the illusion. The whole landscape became a gentle stage set, painted in shadow and starlight. Of course, not every night went perfectly, and the decoy crews had to adapt constantly, learning from each raid, refining their craft as the seasons changed. But there was no bitterness in their work, no glamour either, really, just a steady, patient dedication to a quiet task. They built illusions so that reality could rest a little safer. Today, almost nothing remains of those wooden airfields. The planes have long since weathered away, the lamps are gone, and the fields have returned to quiet farmland. Sheep graze where bombers once stood, made of nothing but timber and hope. And yet, the story lingers, a soft footnote of the war, reminding us that even in difficult times, human imagination found gentle and inventive ways to protect what mattered. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps picture one of those moonlit fields, the little wooden planes standing patiently in the grass, the warm flicker of pretend runway lights, and the quiet craftsmen packing up their tools as dawn approaches. A gentle illusion built with care, watching over the night so that others could rest in peace. Good night and sleep softly. Tonight, let me tell you a quiet story about a library, a city under siege, and the people who believed that books were worth saving. In the autumn of 1940, London was living through the Blitz. Night after night, the city listened to the low hum of aircraft overhead, and in the morning, Londoners would step out of their shelters, blink at the pale light, and begin again. It was a hard time, but even in the hardest times, people look for the things that make life feel whole, and for many, those things were books. Deep in the heart of the city, libraries held treasures that could never be replaced. Old maps, medieval manuscripts, first editions with pages soft as cloth, letters from centuries past, written in careful, flowing ink. These were not just objects. They were memory itself, the written voice of everyone who had come before. And the people who worked among these shelves understood something simple and profound. If the books were lost, a part of the world's memory would be lost with them. So quietly, without fuss or ceremony, the librarians began to plan. They could not stop the bombs, no one could, but they could move the books. They could carry them, box them, wrap them, and tuck them away where the fire and smoke could not reach. Picture these men and women, if you will, clerks in shirt sleeves, elderly catalogers who had spent 40 years among the same shelves, young assistants with strong arms and gentle hands. They moved through the great reading rooms by lamplight, wrapping each volume in soft paper, packing them into crates lined with blankets, almost like tucking children into bed. Fragile maps were laid flat between sheets of card. Delicate bindings were padded with straw. Every box was labeled in a neat, careful hand, because even in a hurry, they refused to be careless. And where did the books go? Some traveled to country houses beyond the city, where long gallery rooms stood empty and quiet, waiting to be filled. Others went into tunnels deep beneath the ground, old stations, cellars, vaults carved into London's ancient clay. There, in the cool and the dark, thousands upon thousands of volumes rested in perfect stillness while the world above them trembled. Imagine those shelves underground. Row after row of books sleeping peacefully, patient as seeds in winter soil. At the British Museum and in libraries across the country, similar work went on. Priceless manuscripts were sent to slate quarries in Wales, where miles of tunnels had once been carved by quarrymen. It was dry there, cool, utterly dark, perfect. The rarest books in the land were shelved in a place that had never seen the sun, waiting for brighter days. Of course, not everything could be saved. Fires did reach some libraries, and some collections were lost. It would be wrong to pretend there was no sorrow in this story. But here is the part worth remembering. The losses were the exception, not the rule, because so many people cared, because they planned and carried and wrapped and labeled. The overwhelming majority of the books came through. And there is one more gentle detail. Even during the darkest nights, libraries did not simply close their doors and wait. Where they could, they stayed open. Reading rooms became warm refuges. People came in from the cold, sat by a lamp and read a novel or studied or simply rested their eyes on familiar printed pages. In a city where so much felt uncertain, a library offered something rare, a place where time moved slowly and where the future still seemed worth preparing for. When the war finally ended, the books came home. The crates were opened, the paper unwrapped, and the volumes were carried back up into the light and returned to their shelves. Librarians walked the galleries of those country houses and the tunnels of those quarries one last time, saying a quiet goodbye to the places that had kept their treasures safe. And then, life resumed. Readers returned. Dust motes drifted once more through shafts of window light. The great libraries of London breathed again. Perhaps that is the loveliest part of this story. Wars are loud and fast and frightening, but books are slow. A book can wait decades for its reader. It can survive in the dark, wrapped in paper, patient and calm, and the people who save books understand that patience. They are, in their own quiet way, gardeners of memory, tending what will bloom long after the storms have passed. So tonight, as you settle into your own soft darkness, think for a moment of those librarians moving gently through lamplit rooms, and of all those books sleeping safely underground, waiting for morning. The storms passed, the books endured, and somewhere, even now, a page is being turned. Rest well and sleep softly. Tonight, let us drift back to the autumn of 1942, to a wide, quiet stretch of the Atlantic Ocean, and to a small wooden lifeboat that carried 11 people for 9 days. This is not a story of battle or hardship told in loud tones. It is a story of stillness, of patience, and of the gentle ways human beings care for one another when there is nothing left but sea and sky. The ship had gone down in the early morning, swiftly and without drama in the end. Just a slow lane, a hiss of steam, and then the ocean folding over the deck. Those who found the lifeboat did so in near silence. Among them were 4 merchant sailors, a young wireless operator, 2 Navy gunners, a cook, and 3 men pulled from the water who had served on the ship no one aboard had known well. 11 souls, 1 boat. And by fortunate chance, a canvas tarp, 2 small water tins, a box of hard biscuits, a few tins of condensed milk, and a bundle of signal flares. The first day was the hardest, though no one said so. The sea moved in long, slow swells, and the boat rose and fell like a sleeper breathing. The captain of this little vessel, by unspoken agreement, was the oldest sailor, a quiet man named Aldous, who had spent 30 years on the water. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply divided the day into small portions. A biscuit each at morning, a sip of water measured into a tin cup that was passed around like something sacred, and long hours of simply sitting, watching the light change on the waves. You might imagine that 9 days adrift would be filled with fear. And of course there was fear, the way there is a draft in an old house, present but not the whole of the atmosphere. Mostly, there was routine. The men rationed their water with arithmetic that became almost meditative. They bilayed rainwater after the third night's shower, tipping their caps to the sky as though thanking a generous neighbor. The cook, a round-faced man named Percy, entertained them each evening by describing in loving detail the meals he would make when they returned. Bread pudding, he said, warm from the oven, roast chicken with sage, tea with real sugar, stirred slowly. The others added their own dishes to this imaginary feast, and by the fifth day the lifeboat contained, in their minds, a banquet worthy of a grand hotel. The young wireless operator, barely 19, kept a small notebook and wrote down the day's small events. A pair of gulls that circled at noon, the flying fish that landed, to Percy's delight, as the makings of a thin breakfast, the northern star that appeared each evening, faithful as a lamplighter, and by which Aldous steered them gently eastward with a broken oar. There were quiet kindnesses woven through every day. The men took turns holding the tarp at night when the spray came over the bow, each taking the wettest watch without being asked. When one of the rescued strangers grew silent and hollow-eyed, the others simply sat closer to him. No speeches, no questions, just the warmth of shoulders touching, which is sometimes the oldest and best medicine. When the boy's hands shook from cold, Aldous wrapped them in his own coat and said, "They'll steady by morning." They always do. And the sea, for its part, was mostly kind. There were long silver dawns that turned the whole ocean to hammered pewter. There were evenings when the water glowed faintly with soft phosphorescence, tiny lights drifting past the hull like fallen stars. The men watched these things with the patience of people who have nowhere else to be, and found, perhaps to their own surprise, that the days had a rhythm almost like peace. On the 9th morning, the boys spotted it first. A smudge on the horizon, grey against grey. A convoy escort steady and unhurried, its smoke rising straight in the still air. The flares went up one and then another, small red blossoms against the pale sky. The ship turned, and as it drew near, the men in the lifeboat did something curious before anything else. They tidied. They stowed the cups, folded the tarp, and straightened the oar, as if presenting their small home respectfully before leaving it. All 11 were taken aboard. All 11 came home in time, to the bread pudding, to the tea with sugar, to the warm beds Percy had promised them nightly for 9 days. What stays with us all these years later is not the danger, but the gentleness, the cup passed hand to hand, the imagined feast, the coat around cold fingers, 9 days in a lifeboat, and in the end, the story is simply this: that people, even drifting on a vast and indifferent ocean, will find ways to be soft with one another. And now, letting that image settle, the small boat, the wide sea, the faithful star, allow your own thoughts to slow and drift where they wish to go. Good night. Tonight, let me tell you a quiet and curious story from the Second World War, the tale of an American soldier who carried a longbow into battle. His name was Jack Churchill, though everyone came to know him as Mad Jack, a nickname given with warmth and a smile. Now, it's true that Jack fought for Britain, not America. He was born in Hong Kong to an English family, but his story crossed the ocean, and it remains one of the strangest, gentlest oddities of the war. A man who marched into the greatest conflict in human history with a sword at his side, a set of bagpipes under his arm, and a longbow strapped across his back. Jack was born in 1906, and long before the war, he had lived many lives. He trained at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, but he also spent years in Burma, working as a newspaper editor. He played the cello, he acted in films, he surfed. Yes, surfed. Riding waves in Australia long before it was common. He was, in many ways, a wanderer, a man who drifted pleasantly through life, collecting skills the way others collect stamps. And among those skills was archery. He had won championships with his bow. He understood it the way a craftsman understands his tools. The pull of the string, the weight of the arrow, the patient stillness required before release. When war came in 1939, Jack did something remarkable. He did not set his old passions aside. Instead, he brought them with him. While other soldiers carried rifles, Jack carried his longbow, an ancient weapon from a much slower age. And in May of 1940, during the defense of a French village called Elepenet, he is said to have done something no other soldier in the war would do. He drew his bow, aimed quietly, and loosed an arrow that struck down an enemy soldier. It remains, as far as anyone knows, the only confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War, a quiet moment from another century, folded gently into a modern war. But Jack was more than curiosity. Those who served beside him remembered him as brave in the old-fashioned sense, calm, steady, almost serene under pressure. He would play his bagpipes as his men advanced, the slow, droning music drifting over the fields, giving them something familiar to follow. At Dunkirk, he fired his bow. In 1941, during a raid in Norway, he led his men ashore while piping them in, playing March of the Cameron Men as the boats approached. His men loved him for it, not because the music made sense, but because it made them feel that someone utterly unshaken was standing beside them. In 1943, in Italy, Jack led a small patrol on a nighttime walk through enemy lines, capturing dozens of prisoners with little more than his sword, his steady voice, and sheer quiet confidence. He would tap a sleeping sentry on the shoulder and simply inform him that he was now a prisoner. Somehow it worked. His men began to believe, as Jack seemed to, that the old ways still had power. Even his famous saying reflected it. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. There was no anger in it, only a kind of wry, good-humored stubbornness. Jack's war, like so many, eventually caught up with him. In 1944, he was captured and sent to a prison camp, but even captivity could not slow him. He escaped not once but twice, the second time walking nearly 100 miles toward freedom before being found. After the war, he did what Jack Churchill did. He kept living gently and strangely. He took up surfing again, riding waves off the coast of Australia into his later years. He grew old by the sea, in a house full of quiet. He passed away in 1996, at the age of 89, leaving behind one of the most curious footnotes in all of military history. Why do we remember him tonight? Perhaps because his story feels like something from a storybook. A gentle reminder that even in the darkest times, a person can carry their own spirit with them unchanged. Jack never became hard. He simply brought who he was, the archer, the piper, the surfer, the swordsman, into a world that had little room for such things. And somehow that was enough. So as you drift towards sleep, picture him for a moment. A calm figure standing in an old field at dawn, longbow in hand, bagpipes over his shoulder, utterly at peace with who he was. Let that image carry you gently into your dreams, and rest well, knowing the world has always had room for quietly remarkable people. Tonight, let us drift back to a quieter corner of the Second World War. A story not of battles, but of board games, paper maps, and the quiet ingenuity of people who helped others find their way home. Imagine a prisoner of war camp somewhere in Germany in the early 1940s. Behind wire fences and guarded gates, time moves slowly. The days are long and grey, but in these camps one small comfort was allowed: packages. The Red Cross sent parcels to prisoners, and among the permitted items were games. Board games, playing cards, puzzles, small amusements to ease the weight of captivity. And among these games, arriving in ordinary parcels, was Monopoly. Now on the surface, it was simply a game. Dice, wooden tokens, pretend money, and a board printed with famous streets. But hidden within some of these boards, there was something more. Tucked quietly beneath the printed paper, some Monopoly sets carried secrets. A thin silk map of the surrounding countryside. A small magnetic compass no bigger than a coin. A metal file shaped to look like a game piece. Even real currency, folded so finely it could slip beneath the board's paper surface. The idea was born in the shadows of wartime London. British intelligence services, working alongside a secret escape aid organization, realized that games were a perfect vessel. Guards rarely searched them closely. A board game seemed harmless, almost childlike, and the Monopoly board itself was cleverly suited to hiding things. Its thick cardboard base could be carefully peeled apart in layers, creating a shallow space. A secret pocket where slim objects could rest, invisible beneath the familiar squares of Old Kent Road and Mayfair. There are some lovely details in this story. The game pieces themselves served a purpose. The metal token shaped like a walking stick could help conceal a tiny compass. Certain editions, marked with a small red dot on the free parking square, quietly told prisoners that this particular board contained escape tools. It was a hidden language, understood only by those who knew to look. The silk maps were especially beautiful things. Silk, you see, is wonderfully practical. Unlike paper, it does not rustle loudly, does not tear easily, and can be folded into a space smaller than a matchbox or worn quietly under clothing. Printers who made parachutes and pilot scarves turned their hands to cartography, printing delicate maps of escape routes across occupied Europe. The ink settled softly into the fabric, and the maps felt almost weightless in the palm of your hand. Why Monopoly, you might wonder? Partly because it was popular and its arrival in camps raised no suspicion. But there was another gentle piece of the puzzle. In those days, the wartime version of the game in Britain used real place names from London. Prisoners, staring at those familiar streets, could study real geography, a small lesson in home disguised as play. The plan worked quietly, and it worked well. Historians believe thousands of these modified game sets made their way into camps. Most prisoners, of course, simply played the game, rolling dice and collecting pretend rent, never knowing what rested beneath their fingertips. But a handful of boards reached the right hands, and for a small number of airmen and soldiers, those hidden compasses and silk maps became the beginning of a long, careful journey. Across fences, through forests, along railway lines, toward freedom. It is worth pausing on how gentle this whole operation was, in its way. No noise, no violence, just patience, craftsmanship, and trust. Craftspeople in workshops carefully built the layered boards. Volunteers packed parcels. Prisoners learned to read the quiet signs. Everyone played their part softly, like notes in a lullaby. And there is a touching irony at the heart of it all. A game about money and property, about buying and selling, became instead a vessel for something priceless. The true treasure of those boards was not the banknotes printed on top, but the hope hidden underneath. After the war, the story remained secret for decades. The people involved spoke little of it, even to their families. Only years later did historians begin piecing it together, from letters, memoirs, and a few surviving boards. Their layers carefully peeled back to reveal the maps and compasses still nestled inside, waiting patiently all those years. So tonight, as you close your eyes, perhaps picture that quiet scene: a dim barracks lamp, a table of prisoners leaning over a Monopoly board, laughter soft in the cold air. Beneath their fingers, under the familiar colored squares, a silk map lies folded and waiting. A compass rests in its secret pocket, its tiny needle dreaming of north. A reminder, perhaps, that even in the hardest of times, kindness and cleverness found their way through, folded neatly, hidden gently, inside the most ordinary of things. Rest well now, and let the story carry you gently into sleep. Close your eyes, if only for a moment, and let your mind drift north, far north, to the cold, quiet waters of the Arctic. Tonight, we remember the sailors of the Arctic convoys, ordinary men who crossed the top of the world during the Second World War, carrying hope through ice and darkness. Between the years of 1941 and 1945, ships sailed from Britain and America toward the northern ports of the Soviet Union, places with soft, snow-covered names like Murmansk and Archangel. These journeys were called the Arctic convoys, and they followed a route that hugged the frozen edge of Norway, past fjords and drifting icebergs, beneath skies that glowed faintly with the northern lights. The men who sailed these waters were not adventurers seeking glory. They were merchant seamen, fishermen, and young naval officers, some barely out of school, who simply answered the call when their countries needed them. Their cargo mattered deeply: tins of food, boots and wool coats, medicine, fuel, and the machines of war. Every crate carried north was a small act of friendship between nations, delivered across one of the harshest seas on Earth. Imagine standing on the deck of a small freighter in January. the air so cold that sea spray froze on the railings, forming delicate white icicles along the wires. The men wrapped themselves in layer upon layer of wool and oilskin, fur-lined gloves, thick scarves, balaclavas pulled down over their ears. Yet even through all that, the cold found its way in, a slow, patient chill that settled into the bones. In winter, the days barely arrived at all. The sun made only the briefest appearance above the horizon, and the men worked by pale lantern light, often for hours at a stretch. In summer, the opposite was true. The midnight sun meant there was no true darkness in which to hide, and yet the sailors adapted. They found a rhythm. Watch shifts passed from one pair of hands to another, hot tea and cocoa passed from galley to deck, small kindnesses passed from shipmate to shipmate. Life aboard the convoy ships had its own quiet textures. Mornings began with strong, sweet tea, the kind that warmed the hands before it warmed the heart. Meals were simple but made with care, porridge, stews, bread with a scrape of butter. The men played cards in the mess when the weather allowed. They hummed songs. They wrote letters home, letters filled with gentle words and careful reassurances, leaving out the hardship so their families would not worry. The sea itself was a constant companion, sometimes kind, sometimes not. Waves rolled in from the Atlantic, tall and gray-green, and the ships rose and fell with a slow, patient rhythm. Ice formed on the upper decks, and the men took turns chipping it away with hammers, for a ship weighed down with ice rides low and heavy in the water. It was laborious, cold work, but there was something steadying about it too. The simple repetition, the shared purpose, the quiet camaraderie of men working side by side. Their protectors sailed with them, destroyers and corvettes cutting white foam through the water, watchful and steady. Sometimes aircraft patrolled overhead. The enemy was out there, of course. But for long stretches of the journey, there was only sea and sky, and the soft, breathing rhythm of the convoy moving as one. Among the most remembered moments was the story of a conv in the summer of 1942, a difficult passage when the ships were scattered by weather and shadowed by threat. Many vessels were lost, and yet many more pressed on, arriving one by one at those northern harbors where Russian dockworkers, bundled in coats, greeted them with waves and tired smiles. The cargo was unloaded, the crews rested, and then, after a short while, they turned around and made the journey home again, and again. And again, for years. In time, the world came to understand what these sailors had given. Winston Churchill himself called it the worst journey in the world, a phrase the men received with modest shrugs and quiet pride. Many decades later, long after the guns had fallen silent, the Arctic convoys were finally honored with their own medal. A small star pinned to old chests in recognition of journeys made more than 70 years before. Today, the Arctic waters are calm, the convoys are history, and the men who sailed them have grown old or passed gently on, but their story remains, a story not of glory, but of endurance, of warmth found in cold places, of friendship carried across ice. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, picture one of those sailors standing an evening watch on a quiet deck, the aurora shimmering faintly overhead, the ship rocking gently, the world hushed and vast. He is cold, but he is steady. He is far from home, but he is not alone. And somewhere in that thought, there is peace. Sleep well and sail gently into your dreams. Tonight, let us drift back to the quiet hills of Europe during the Second World War and visit a small village that, against all expectation, was never invaded, not because it was hidden from the maps, but because of a series of small, gentle coincidences that seemed to wrap the place in a kind of invisible protection. Picture a valley in the countryside. Let us imagine it somewhere in rural France. A cluster of stone houses with slate roofs, a narrow river winding past, a little stone bridge worn smooth by centuries of cart wheels. The village was called nothing famous. It appeared on maps only as a faint mark, one name among thousands. The people who lived there were farmers and bakers and school teachers, people whose lives moved with the rhythm of the seasons rather than the rhythm of history. When the war swept across Europe in 1940, most of the region around the village changed hands quickly. Roads filled with moving columns, Distant horizons glowed at night, and radio sets in farmhouse kitchens carried voices speaking of places far away. And yet, in this valley, the days remained strangely ordinary. The baker still lit his ovens before dawn. The church bell still rang the hours. The fields still needed tending, and so they were tended. Why was this village left alone? The answer, when the villagers pieced it together after the war, was a gentle chain of small accidents. Coincidences stacked one upon another like leaves settling softly on still water. The first had to do with a bridge. An old inventory, drawn up years earlier by a road engineer, had listed the stone bridge as unsuitable for heavy vehicles. A clerical note based on a measurement taken on a damp morning when the wood of his ruler had swollen slightly. The note was never corrected. And so, when military planners traced their routes, their pencils simply slid around this valley, marking it as impassable for the heavy transports that needed to pass that way. The second coincidence involved fog, or rather, the particular way the fog behaved in this valley. On the few occasions when aircraft passed overhead on reconnaissance flights, the morning mist that rose from the river had settled over the rooftops like a soft grey blanket. From above, the village appeared only as a vague smudge, one grey patch among many grey patches. The photographs, when they were developed, showed nothing worth noting. A village half guessed at is a village half forgotten. And the third coincidence was perhaps the quietest of all. An officer, passing through the region early in the occupation years, stopped for a meal at a small inn, and found the food good, the bed clean, and the people polite in that reserved way of country folk everywhere. He wrote a brief note in his ledger, nothing official, just a private remark. This valley offered nothing of value and no trouble. That single sentence, written in a weary hand at the end of a long day, was enough. No one searched further, no one asked more questions. And so the war, which raged like a storm over the mountains and along the distant river roads, never turned down into this valley. The village heard the thunder but never felt the rain. Young men from the village did go away to serve, as young men everywhere did, and some letters home took long months to arrive. But the village itself, its stone houses, its bridge, its little school with the ivy on the wall, remained exactly as it had always been. There is something quietly moving about that, isn't there? In a time when so much of the world was rearranged by force, this one small place was spared not by armies or weapons, but by a swollen ruler, a soft morning fog, and a tired man's kindly sentence in a notebook. After the war ended, and the maps were redrawn and corrected and filed away, the villagers sometimes spoke of their good fortune at the market or after Sunday service. They did not celebrate it loudly. They simply planted their gardens a little more gratefully, and the church bell rang the hours as it always had. Today, if you were to visit a valley like this one, the bridge is still there, and the river still winds past, and the fog still rises softly on autumn mornings. And perhaps that is the gentlest lesson this story offers, that history is not only made of great clashes and famous speeches. Sometimes, history is made of things that do not happen, of roads not taken, of notes misfiled, of mist that hides a rooftop from view. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, picture that village, the bridge in the evening light, the smoke rising gently from stone chimneys, the fields at rest. Somewhere in the wide story of those difficult years, there was always a quiet place like this. And for a few minutes, let your own thoughts rest there too, safe, still, and undisturbed, as the night settles softly all around. Let me tell you a quiet story from a quiet time, a story about music, patience, and the gentlest kind of courage. It is a tale from the Second World War, but there is nothing here to trouble your rest. Only a woman, a microphone, and the soft hum of radio waves drifting through the evening air. In the early 1940s, London was a city of blacked-out windows and hushed streets. At night, the city darkened itself like someone pulling a blanket over their head, hoping the storms passing overhead would simply drift away. But even in the darkness, voices traveled. Radio waves carried news, music, and comfort into millions of homes. And it was there, in that invisible world of sound, that our story begins. Her name, in the way such stories are remembered, was Elsie Marlowe. Before the war, she had been a singer, not the most famous, not the most celebrated, but a voice people recognized. Her songs played on the wireless on Sunday afternoons, gentle melodies that families listened to while they ironed their clothes or waited for the kettle to boil. She knew sound the way a farmer knows weather, every shade and texture of it, every small irregularity. When war came, the concert halls grew quiet, but Elsie's ear for sound did not fade. And one evening, while listening to a broadcast, she noticed something curious, a small detail, barely a whisper in the recording, a background noise, faint and rhythmic, that did not belong. It was the kind of thing no ordinary listener would ever catch, but she caught it. She mentioned it quietly to a friend who worked in an office she never asked too much about, and that, as it turned out, was enough. Because in those years, Britain had gathered a small and unusual group of listeners, people with gifted ears, to monitor the airwaves. They were looking for secret transmissions, hidden codes, the faint signatures of enemy agents broadcasting from quiet apartments and rented rooms across the country. The work they did was called, unglamorously, listening, and Elsie was invited to do it. So her stage became a small room with heavy curtains and a pair of headphones. Instead of an audience, there was a crackling dial, a notebook, and hours of soft static. Night after night, she tuned through frequencies the way she once moved through scales, patiently, attentively, listening for the one note that didn't belong. And she found them, not with drama, not with danger, but with patience. A hand-keyed signal buried beneath music, a voice reading what sounded like an innocent weather report, but with a rhythm underneath it, numbers spaced just so, a faint hum of machinery that told trained listeners where in Europe a transmitter had been made. Each small discovery went into a report, and each report joined thousands of others, slowly forming a picture. Because that is how the quiet work of catching spies really happened. Not through blazing gunfights, but through notebooks filled with frequencies. Through double agents whose false reports were composed like songs, each word chosen to keep the enemy listening while the truth moved elsewhere. Elsie's musical ear, her sense of timing, of rhythm, of the small hesitations in a human voice, made her unusually good at it. She could hear, in the cadence of a coded message, whether the sender was nervous, whether they were new, whether they were lying. Over the years, the signals she and her fellow listeners traced helped confirm the identities of hidden agents, men and women transmitting secrets from seaside boarding houses and city flats. Some were turned, gently, strategically, into channels of false information. And the false information they sent helped weave one of the great quiet deceptions of the war, convincing faraway commanders of things that were simply not true, on nights when the truth needed protecting. When it was all over, Elsie went back to singing. She never wrote a memoir, she gave no speeches. If you had asked her about the war, she might have smiled and said she had done her small part, the way everyone did their small part, and left it there. But somewhere in the archives, in faded notebooks and crackling recordings, the traces of her listening remain, a reminder that courage has many textures. Some courage is loud, some of it marches, but some of it sits very still in a dim room, wearing headphones, hour after hour, trusting that patience itself is a kind of strength, that a careful ear, a calm heart, and a willingness to pay attention can matter as much as anything else. And perhaps that is a comfort to carry into sleep tonight, that in a noisy, restless world, there has always been quiet power in simply listening, closely, gently, and well. Good night, listener. The frequencies are quiet now, and so may you be. As the evening settles softly around you, let us drift back together to the long corridors of military history, where tanks received their names not from machines or numbers, but from people, generals, mostly, men whose names were spoken across battlefields long after they had gone. It is a curious little tradition, if you think about it. A tank is a thing of steel and engine noise, and yet so many of them carry the names of men who never rode inside one. Tonight, let us wander gently through this strange naming custom, slowly, the way one strolls through a quiet museum after closing time. Begin with the Americans. In the years of the Second World War, the United States had a simple, almost affectionate habit, naming tanks after famous generals of the Civil War, that old, distant conflict that had ended more than 70 years before. There was the M3 Lee, named for Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, and there was the M4 Sherman, named for William Tecumseh Sherman, the Union general who once marched across Georgia. Strange, isn't it? That two generals who fought against each other should one day share a family of tanks, side by side, in the same army. There is a gentle irony hiding in that fact. The British, who received many American tanks through Lend-Lease, were the ones who popularized the name Sherman. They liked naming tanks after American generals, and the Americans eventually followed along. So a tank designed in Detroit, built in thousands, would carry the name of a Southern-born general and be driven by young men from Iowa, Texas, and Ohio, across fields in Normandy. History has a way of braiding things together like that. The British themselves had their own tradition, a rather poetic one. Their tanks were often named after lines of ancient kings: Crusader, Cromwell, Churchill. The Churchill tank carried the name of the Prime Minister himself, who reportedly joked that the tank had more flaws than he did. A wry little remark, delivered with that famous chuckle of his. Earlier British tanks bore the names of World War I generals, the Matilda. A name with an even older story, borrowed from a cartoon duck of all things, before it became the name of a slow, sturdy little infantry tank that earned quiet respect in the deserts of North Africa. And what of the Germans? Here the tradition takes a different turn. German tanks bore numbers: Panther, Tiger, names of animals swift and strong. But interestingly, the most famous German tanks of the era carried no general's name at all during the war. The name Tiger came later, a nickname that stuck, while the Panther prowled through history under the name of a great cat. It was only after the war, and much later still, that German post-war tanks, like the Leopard, continued the animal tradition instead. A different kind of naming custom, quieter, less personal, as if the Germans preferred their machines to be creatures rather than men. The Soviets took yet another path, and perhaps the most personal one of all. Their great medium tank, the T-34, was a number, but their heavy tank, the KV, bore the initials of Kliment Voroshilov, and the Joseph Stalin tank, the IS series, which stood for Iosif Stalin, carried the leader's own name. And in one of the strangest little twists of the era, the Americans designed a heavy tank late in the war and named it the M26 Pershing, after General John J. Pershing, who had commanded American forces in the First World War. So as the war in Europe drew to a close, Pershing faced Stalin's tanks in the emerging chill of a new age. Two names, two traditions, quietly mirroring each other across a divided continent. Why generals, you might wonder, drifting towards sleep? Partly it was affection, a nation naming its Iron Guardians after beloved or legendary figures. Partly it was politics, a quiet nod to allies or to heroes from a shared past. The French, too, joined in later, naming post-war tanks after figures like the AMX series, while other nations named theirs after rivers, mountains, or saints. There is something almost tender about it when you think of it softly. These great machines, rolling slowly across the pages of history, each one carrying a human name like a small lantern. The men themselves were complicated figures, flawed, distant, shaped by their own hard times, but their names became something else entirely. Familiar words in the mouths of young crews, painted sometimes on turret sides, spoken in letters home. And now, as the night deepens around you, you can let the images settle. The Lee and the Sherman, resting in a quiet field at dusk. The Cromwell and the Churchill, named for a kingmaker and a prime minister. The Pershing, rolling gently over a bridge in the last spring of the war. Each one a small story, wrapped in steel, carrying a name from long ago. Let the engines fade now, let the fields grow quiet, and let yourself drift gently into rest. The names will still be there tomorrow, waiting patiently in the pages of history, exactly where we left them. Good night. Tonight, we drift back to the final days of the Second World War, to a quiet surrender that almost nobody heard about, and one that took years to fully reach the world's ears. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the bells rang across cities and villages. The guns fell silent on the western fronts, and people poured into the streets, weeping with relief. The documents had been signed, the armies had laid down their weapons, and history books, for the most part, closed their chapters there. But far away, in scattered corners of the world, the war lingered on like a soft echo in an empty hall. Small groups of soldiers, isolated on remote islands and in vast forests, had not yet received the news, or perhaps could not yet bring themselves to believe it. Some of these men were Japanese soldiers, stationed on tiny Pacific islands, places with poetic names and dense green canopies, where the jungle swallowed sound and time seemed to move slowly, if at all. Cut off from their homelands, with radios broken or silent, they continued their watch. For them, the war had not ended, because no one had come to tell them so. Perhaps the most gentle and remarkable of these stories belongs to a man named Hiroo Onoda, a young intelligence officer stationed on the Philippine island of Lubang. When the war ended, leaflets drifted down from the sky, carried on the warm ocean breezes, telling the soldiers that peace had come. But Onoda and his small band were cautious men, trained to distrust enemy tricks. Leaflets, they reasoned, could be lies, and so they waited and watched, and kept their quiet vigil in the deep green hills. The years passed like water under a bridge. The world rebuilt itself. Children were born who had never known the sound of air raid sirens. And still, in the humid stillness of the jungle, a handful of men continued a war that had quietly ended long ago. They lived simply, tending small gardens, gathering food from the forest, mending their uniforms with careful stitches. Their days had a rhythm: morning watch, evening watch, the soft patter of tropical rain on broad leaves. It was a life of patience and discipline, almost like a monk's devotion. Except their devotion was to an order given long ago: hold your ground and wait for orders to the contrary. One by one, his companions left the jungle, some through illness, some through sorrowful misunderstandings with local villagers, until, at last, Onoda remained alone, a single thread of the old war, still woven into the fabric of a peaceful world. And here the story turns tender. In 1974, nearly 30 years after the war's end, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki came searching for him, not to capture him, not to shame him, but simply because he was curious. He found Onoda and spoke with him kindly, beneath the canopy where sunlight fell in soft golden patches. But the soldier would not surrender to just anyone. His orders, he said, must be formally lifted by his commanding officer. So the world quietly arranged it. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now an older man, was brought out of retirement and flown to the island. There, in a small clearing in the shade of the trees, he read the formal orders, relieving Onoda of his duty at last. The old soldier listened, nodded slowly, and surrendered his rifle, a rifle he had kept clean and cared for all those years, as faithfully as a gardener tends a beloved tree. He wept gently, and then he went home to a country he barely recognized, and chose, remarkably, a life of peace, eventually founding a nature camp for children in Japan, teaching young people to live simply and kindly with the natural world. Why did so few people hear about this final surrender for so long? Perhaps because the world had already turned the page. Perhaps because these quiet endings did not make for triumphant headlines. They were small human stories, stories of loyalty, patience, and the long shadow of duty. Other holdouts emerged even later, rumors and discoveries trickling in through the 70s, each one a soft reminder that history does not always end on schedule. There is something deeply soothing in this tale if we let it settle over us. It reminds us that even the longest vigils end, that the most stubborn conflicts, carried alone in the dark, can finally be set down with a kind word and proper permission. That peace, patient and quiet, always arrives, even if it takes years to reach the furthest corners. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that small clearing in the jungle, the green light through the leaves, the sound of a rifle being laid down gently at last, and let your own worries, your own long-held tensions, Surrender in the same soft way, quietly, completely, and without resistance. Rest now, the watch is over, and all is well.